Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. This is story about what if Naruto is sent to the past to prevent it from never happening. Part 1. Before I start, please do support for more amazing content and comments for part 2. Do consider to subscribe my channel and share my video to your friends and check out the description as well. Let's start the video. There was nothing left. Konoha was years gone and the last of the villages fell years earlier with only a handful of survivors from the allied shinobi forces left to fight Kaguya. After countless civilian deaths and the shinobi forces reduced to less than 20, the survivors of a war that had raged for nearly 10 years had just about given up hope, because even if they were victorious, what did they have to show for it? Their homes, their families, everything they'd ever held dear was gone. Even Naruto, for all the power that had been given to him so that he could win from the Rakuto Sannin himself and from eventually having every bija sealed inside of him, was too weak to defeat the rabbit goddess Kaguya. When Killer Bee had died, he trusted Gyuki to help him and him to save the world, but even with the cooperation of all the beasts, with their numbers so low, there was nearly nothing they could do. Countless years of studying between battles, learning everything he could about seals and weapons and the mountain's worth of jutsu, even picking up some small, very small, genjutsu skills, for nothing. There were 4 Konoha shinobi left and a couple from the other villages in the alliance. Naruto himself, Shikamaru, Tenten, and Sasuke were all that were left out of thousands. Kankuro of Suna was still alive along with 3 others, and Iwa, Kiri and Kumo had 3, 2 and 3 respectively. Those from the land of iron were gone. Out of the 16 remaining soldiers, only 12 could still fight. Sasuke was almost completely blind from continued use of his Mangekyo Sharingan and sick. He said Itachi had succumbed to something similar during their battle. Naruto decided he didn't want to think too much about what that meant. Shikamaru had been reduced to a talking brain, barely able to move and confined to the bunker they'd made their shelter, and 2 out of the 3 remaining Kumo Nin were also sick from exposure. Everyone was thin, provisions running low, and no way or place to get more. Out of everyone, though, it was Naruto who had changed the most. His hair, once short and spiky and decidedly blonde, had, upon the resealing of Kurama and the subsequent sealing of the other bijou for reasons not even Kurama understood, become a dark red like the blood of his fallen comrades and grown significantly in length, reaching his thighs when down. Even his eyes had darkened, though he wasn't sure if that was from age and war or if that was also a result of the sealing. Years of hiding in various bunkers left his skin pale, and the extraction of Kurama left his whisker marks light like scars. He was thin now, baby fat no longer clinging to his face, but still toned with muscle and covered in scarring. The loss of his many comrades, of his surrogate family, the weight of being unable to protect the things he devoted his life to had made Naruto quieter, hardened a part of him that had remained soft and innocent for so long. The idea had come from Shikamaru in a rare moment of humor almost 3 years earlier. Naruto had been scribbling on the walls after running out of sealing papers when someone he couldn't quite remember who had made the passing comment of, "It's too bad we can't go back to when times were simple, huh?" The comment had earned wistful smiles from a few of the last shinobi, whose numbers had been significantly higher at almost 400 at the time. Naruto, the now redhead, didn't look up but gave a silent nod. "Can you do that with seals?" It was supposed to be a joke based off of a remark Naruto had made when he'd first started studying them when he was 18 about seals being able to do anything, but it made Naruto think, halting his brush strokes. Space-time seals and jutsu had been a thing since long before he was born. They're what his father and Tobirama had used to create the Hiraishin, and what Kamui was based off of. "It might be possible, with enough chakra and the right formula," he responded, not really thinking too much about the fact he was saying it out loud. "If it is possible, it would probably only work one way, not to mention how dangerous it would be. It might not even change anything. Time could split and create a parallel timeline even if someone did manage it." Of course, no one had expected that as an answer, but even 6 years into war, Naruto was still Konoha's #1 unpredictable knucklehead ninja, even if he was significantly less knuckleheaded than before. Shikamaru, of course, recovered from the information first. Wouldn't it be worth it? To save everyone? Prevent them from facing this? It had taken years to complete, and careful planning with help from both Sasuke and Shikamaru to finish it. The seal itself had to be huge, and even through Naruto's many protests, the remaining shinobi offered their lives to give Naruto the chance to change it. The chakra needed was almost unimaginable for a single person, and they knew from many experiments that it could only send one person, and the time it would take to write out given their situation made the odds seem even lower. A small group offered themselves as a distraction for Kaguya, one they knew would end their lives, and the others offered their chakra to power the outer matrices of the seal, another sacrifice of their lives, and if it didn't work, Naruto didn't know what he would do, because then he'd be alone, and over 9 years of devastation had been for nothing. Even now it seemed everything they'd fought for had been for nothing. It won't have meant anything if Naruto fails. The seal was massive, more so than Naruto had thought it would be, and consisted of several parts. a configuration for a rough estimate of the years he'd need to travel back, an event and location to travel to, a matrix for the movement of time and space itself, namely moving the object within the center to whatever time was specified, safeguards upon safeguards. Layers of detail to make the trip as safe as possible and the jump as accurate as possible, not to mention the careful configurations of the formula to actually make it work. In the end, it was similar to Hiraishin, only instead of moving the user from one place to another in a way similar to traveling to the near future, it was the opposite, going to a location in the past. The amount of chakra he needed was nearly immeasurable. The drain those who volunteered themselves would face would be fatal, and Naruto would have, if he was correct, barely enough to survive. He'd probably be passed out for a few days, and if he were to end up too close to any of the shinobi villages, he could be killed or taken prisoner before he could carry out the tasks necessary. Saying their final goodbyes was hard. The three who were playing distraction had left before the seal was even drawn to buy them enough time, and none of them had any doubt the encounter would brutalize all of them. The 12 helping him, consisting of 4 people who'd become his closest friends and 8 others who'd been at the end of their ropes since their villages fell but remained strong in the battle and fought with everything they could, they were the ones who'd had the hardest time. Knowing that whether or not this worked their time was up, they were putting all their faith in Naruto, and the weight was heavier than any other he'd felt during the war. They were quick, because they knew if they took too long it would be for nothing, so Naruto sent a clone to gather sage chakra while he made his rounds. Tenten hugged him tightly and he squeezed back. When the weapon's mistress stepped back, she looked into his deep blue-violet eyes, barely holding back her tears. "Good luck, Naruto." It was a whisper but firm nonetheless, and the most indirect goodbye he'd received. Shikamaru, mostly paralyzed as he was, couldn't do much, but the look in his dark eyes, the grief and hope, relief, fear said everything he wasn't. Somehow it was more of a goodbye than any he could have said out loud. He held out a pale hand and Naruto took it, trying not to squeeze too hard. "Save us." It wasn't a request, and if the atmosphere were any lighter, Naruto would have laughed. The blonde-turned redhead responded just as firmly. "I will." And he would, or he would die trying, because that's all he's ever known. Never in his life has he ever given up, even knowing that this war was a lost cause never stopped him from trying. Kankuro, who'd taken over as leader of the Suna division years earlier after Kagaya's wrath destroyed both of his siblings, similar to how Naruto himself had been named Hokage after Tsunade had been killed, shook Naruto's hand, tears smearing the purple war paint decorating his face. "Save my brother?" It wasn't meant to be a question, but it sounded like one. Naruto nodded. Of course. Because Gaara had become family to him, and his loss hurt him almost as deeply as it did Kankuro. "Goodbye, Naruto." His voice shook, and even without being able to sense negative emotions, Naruto could feel the fear pouring off of him, because even though he had nothing left, he was terrified to see what might happen after death. "Bye, Kankuro." It was just as likely Naruto would die trying to do this. They had no way to tell if it would work for long jumps. Even if experiments with short periods of time worked just fine, they were tests on non-living things. Sasuke had been the hardest. The man could barely see anything beyond blurry shadows and was coughing up blood every time he moved too much, and seeing him like that hurt because Sasuke was never supposed to be that way. He was supposed to be strong and arrogant and prideful, not weak and sickly. They looked at each other wordlessly for a moment, neither knew how long, and no one interrupted them. His Rinnegan eye was closed and Sharingan was inactive for the first time in what was probably years. Natural eye now a milky gray instead of deep black, and through all the pain he was in, Sasuke managed a small smirk. "Dope." Naruto could have cried right then. It took every ounce of control he had not to. "Team," he barely managed to get it out. It had been so long since they'd called each other that. They were too concerned with war and, until the last couple years, been stationed in different camps. With what little strength he had, Sasuke pulled Naruto close to him. Even after 9 years, the Jinchuriki had barely grown, having leveled out at around 167 centimeters, and held onto him tightly. Burying his nose in the younger man's oily red was odd, when he could actually see Naruto with red hair. He'd known him as a blonde their whole lives, and as much as he never would have admitted it if circumstances hadn't been what they were, he missed it. Even now, he was almost glad he couldn't see it, and could pretend it was still blonde. He did, however, wish he could see Naruto's face one last time, see his bright smile again before he died, even though he knew he'd never manage one even if he could. He ran a thin, pale hand across the shorter shinobi's jaw, tilting his head up as best he could before pressing their chapped lips together. It was technically their second kiss, but it felt like second nature. There wasn't time for budding relationships in an active war zone, and they had no time alone, but none of that mattered anymore. Time fell apart around them as they kissed. There were no wandering hands, no heat or passion or anything Jiraiya had written about when he was alive. It was love, so much love, and anger and pain, grief and longing, relief and happiness and goodbye and everything neither of them ever said. Even with the metallic taste of blood and dry chapped lips, it was everything either of them could have wanted, and when they pulled apart they could still feel the phantom pressure. Make Team 7 what it was meant to be, and do what you do best, save as many as you can. It was spoken directly into his ear, and Naruto knew that all of them, those they've lost and those he was about to lose, they would all be with him even if he could never truly be with them again. Always. They didn't move from their embrace for another moment, lamenting what could have been and wishing they had more time. It's time, someone said, likely knowing that if they didn't do this right now, Naruto would never leave. They both nodded, and Naruto guided Sasuke to his point on the seal, showing him where to pump his chakra. When he turned to make his way to the center, a cold hand grabbed his ankle. Naruto, take this. Sasuke held out his sword to the redhead. Over years of war, Naruto had become well versed in nearly every weapon available, and if Sasuke could give him anything after all the grief he put him through, this was the least he could do. I'll take care of it. Because if he said anything more emotional than that, he wouldn't be able to leave. Even still, a part of him didn't want to go through with it. It felt wrong to leave this timeline and abandon everyone. Because dying in another timeline meant never seeing these people again. They would be there, but they wouldn't be his, and it felt like a betrayal. But knowing that he could save them made it feel like any pain he could ever feel would make it all worth it. One person was posted at each point of the seal, creating a clock, and one at a time, starting at the top, with Sasuke, and working their way around counterclockwise, they began pumping their chakra into the seal. Wind whipped around the redhead standing in the center as chakra surged through to him. Naruto released his clone, accepting the sage chakra into himself, just as the last person began pumping their life into his seal. He took a deep, shaky breath before he pumped chakra into the center. Sage chakra, his own chakra, and each of the bijou inside of him shared theirs as well, went into powering the seal, speeding up the vortex of wind and time. It was like standing in a hurricane, the seal below him glowing bright blue, visibility diminished beyond the center matrix. When he could sense that there was enough chakra for the final step, he bit deeply into his thumb and drew the key to the seal on his palm, slamming into the center, releasing it. Everything around him turned white, and he closed his eyes, allowing himself to be sucked into the vortex as the seal continued to take energy from him. As his eyes grew heavy, he knew he'd either wake up in the past or wake up to 12 corpses, or he wouldn't wake up at all. He prepared himself for any outcome as he finally let unconsciousness take over. Konoha was a calm village. During times of peace it seemed like the perfect place to live, whether you were a civilian or a shinobi, and during times of war it seemed like one of the safest places. Tall walls protected the village from most attacks, and the well-trained shinobi, many of which were renowned throughout the elemental nations, were there to defend alongside it. Konoha, the village hidden in the leaves, had produced some of the finest shinobi throughout the ages. The Shodame and Naidame Hokages Hashirama and Tobirama, Madara, as evil as he'd been, there was no doubt he was an exceptional ninja, the student of the Naidame and his successor Sarutobi Hiruzen, all three of the Sandame's students given the title of the Sannin, the great medic and granddaughter of the Shodame Tsunade, the toad sage of MT Myobuk Jiraiya and Orochimaru the snake Sannin. Jiraiya's prize student and Yandame Hokage Namikaze Minato, who'd saved the village from the Kyuubi no Kitsun's brutal attack, the Yandame's student Hatake Kakashi, as well as his father, Konoha's white fang, Hatake Tsukumo, and the Uchiha prodigy Uchiha Itachi were all well-known and feared shinobi, not to mention dozens of others. For any shinobi, especially the best of the best, taking down an S-rank nuke nin or two was an accomplishment, and a rare one at that. It wasn't often that lone shinobi survived encounters with multiple missing nin, let alone were able to take them down and come out relatively free of injury. Now, being a ninja meant you were used to rumors, most of the time far exaggerated, though that can also be an advantage, but that's usually all they were. Rumors. Based on some form of truth, sure, but overall mostly false. So when rumors made their way to Konoha about a mysterious red-haired shinobi wearing an Yuzushiogakure Hitite who'd apparently taken down 5 S-rank nuke nin, all from a group known to travel in pairs, all within 2 years when they'd been trying to tack the group down for far longer, it was understandably shocking. Deidara of IWA. Haiden of Yu. Kakuzu of Taki. Sasori of the Red Sand from Suna. Hashigaki Kisame of Kiri. All S-rank shinobi of the highest caliber, known for their destructive power and being utterly merciless in battle. All gone. All dead in less than 20 months. Only it wasn't just a rumor, because the bounties had been claimed with proof of the kill, the heads of each missing nin given to the village of origin as proof of their demise, and in Kisame's case, his sword Samahata. Which, if the rumors coming from Kiri were to be believed, was delivered to them sealed with a complex fuinjutsu that even the seal master of the village had a hard time cracking. Not to mention word spreading of the Yondaime Mizuki having been under a genjutsu since his reign of terror had begun, which had been broken by said mysterious shinobi upon the return of Samahata, and had started making amends with his village. He even acknowledged that though his actions weren't his own, it was no excuse and he didn't expect anyone to trust his word, even going so far as to say he'd step down after fixing what he'd broken. The whole thing was odd, especially when word reached Konoha that the Mizuki was also the Jinchuriki of the Sanbai and had declared the red-headed shinobi an ally, as well as any village he chooses to align himself with, which what? Of Kiri. This man had single-handedly stopped a civil war that had been destroying the village for years in a matter of days, and Kiri was working toward forgiving the man for the actions that weren't his own. For the Sandaime Hokage, the information was troubling. On one hand, as a past ally of Uzushio, it was his responsibility as Hokage to offer Konoha's hospitality to the shinobi, if he truly was from Uzushio at all. On the other hand, rumors about the man said his name was Uzumaki, which would also, normally, be a good thing if it were true. The trouble arose with a certain blonde-haired troublemaker. If this man was truly an Uzumaki, it made him a relative of Naruto's, no matter how distant, and the boy deserved that, deserved family more than anyone else Hiruzen knew. But if he was lying about his identity as an Uzumaki or posed any kind of threat to the village, then avoiding all contact, or even eliminating him, would be the safest options, though maybe not the latter with Kiri standing behind him, not to mention the rumored friendship, no matter how odd it seemed to everyone, with Kumo's Killer Bee, who, oddly enough, was also a Jinchuriki. But if he did, then Kirigakure may finally become an ally to Konoha after so many years of animosity. Hiruzen put the coincidence to the rumors that the Akatsuki had been planning on taking the Jinchuriki and let it go for now. After all, he never once heard a rumor of the redhead threatening any of the Jinchuriki in any way, and if he had, he was sure Kumo would have his head already for daring to threaten their Jinchuriki-sama. Even if he knew not everyone in Kumo shared that respect for the Hachibi Jinchuriki, Hiruzen wished Konoha could look at Naruto the same way someday. The heavily wrinkled shinobi leader wrote out a quick message. He was sure his student had heard about the man who'd sent the hidden villages into political chaos, and fully expected him to have at least some of the facts, and to get back to the village within 5 days of receiving his summons. There was a reason he was one of he relied so heavily on his infiltration missions, and it had nothing to do with his research, though the books that came out of it weren't a bad result of said research as far as Sarutobi was concerned. He called to one of his umbu. Torai, get this to Jiraiya immediately. His tone left no room for argument or hesitation, not that one of the Hokage's trusted umbu ever would hesitate, and Tori disappeared with the message. Last anyone had heard, the Sandaime's white-haired student had been in Yugakure to research, and finding the man once you did find whatever village he was in was never hard, just follow the sound of perverted giggles or screaming women. The only other man still living with any real knowledge on the Uzumaki and with the time and ability to gauge whether or not he was a potential threat to the village was already in the village, and could be called into his office when Jiraiya was back. Only after discussing it with both men would he bring the decision to the clan heads. Seeing as Naro Shikaka was the smartest man he'd ever met, Hiruzen had no doubt he and the rest of the retired Ino Shikacho team would have good insight into the matter as well. Not to mention bringing an S-rank shinobi into the village where their children were being raised, without their knowledge would no doubt incur their wrath in their own way, likely one that would result in more paperwork added on to the near-endless pile he could never seem to get rid of. Jiraiya had heard countless rumors about the mysterious Uzushio shinobi who'd seemed to just appear about 2 years earlier. The most recent being that, upon returning Samahata to Kirigakure no Sato, he'd realized the Mizuki had, in fact, been controlled for nearly his entire reign over Water Country and had become an ally and friend to Yugura of the Bloody Mist. The fact that he and his ally in Kumo, Killer Bee, were both Jinchuriki only made Jiraiya want more information. As soon as the information that the man had taken down half of a group that had been planning on taking the 9 Jinchuriki and in the process earned their respect enough for them to consider him an ally to their villages and was supposedly an Uzumaki, had Jiraiya chasing down leads almost immediately. He found that, while he was still missing information regarding 2 of them, one more from Kumo and another from Kiri, it was rumored that he'd gained favor from both Iwa Jinchuriki, who returned to their home villages, as well as the Taki Jinchuriki and Suna Jinchuriki, both only a little older than his godson. That was another thing entirely. His godson, the current Jinchuriki of the Kyuubi and one of only other living Uzumaki that Jiraiya knew of, could possibly find family in this man. If he was what he seemed. The Toad Sage of course knew that the Uzumaki, and other inhabitants of Uzushio, had treated those chosen to hold Bijou differently than other villages. They considered it an honor where others scorned the chosen few. Despite the respect the Uzushio nin clearly showed the 2 Jinchuriki, Jiraiya couldn't shake the idea that there was more to everything the man was doing, even if it was only a gut feeling for now. At the very least he seemed to be exceptional with the dying art of Fuinjutsu, which Uzushio had been known for teaching and the Uzumaki had been renowned for being naturally proficient with. He'd been about to chase another lead when Konoha Umbu tracked him down with a summons from his old sensei who, upon hearing the same rumors Jiraiya had been chasing for weeks, had come to the same conclusion regarding Naruto and the possible relation he shared with the red-headed bounty hunter. He figured his sensei likely wanted to offer the man a place in Konoha, lest Kiri or Kumo, who weren't on the best of terms with Konoha, sink their claws into him, metaphorically speaking. He made his way to Konoha quickly, shortening a 3-day-long trip to about a day from the edge of Utakure. He didn't even stop to peep in the women's side of the hot springs. When he made it to his sensei's office, Sarutobi was already waiting there for him and Kakashi followed behind him, only a couple minutes slower than the older Nin. It was surprising to see Minato's prize student and Konoha's copy Nin on time for once, but the Toad Sage didn't comment on it. The one-eyed shinobi nodded his head in respect to the Sannin, oddly serious and lacking his usual nothing bothers me air, and the Sannin responded in kind. Jiraiya couldn't help but wonder what the Sandaime Hokage had said to get the man to his office on time, and to make him shed his typical aloofness. Now that you're both here, I want to talk about what to do about the rumors making their rounds about a bounty hunter hailing from the fallen Uzushio claiming to be of Uzumaki blood. The professor was all business, the usual mirth missing from his brown eyes. He turned to his ex-student. Jiraiya, I assume you have information? The Toad Sannin nodded once. I first caught wind of him almost 2 years ago when he scoured the shinobi villages looking for stolen Uzushio scrolls, books, and other artifacts. I've been chasing leads on the man as he's become more active in the recent months with 5 members of the group of Nuke Nin, Akatsuki, all confirmed dead, and he's gained fans in the form of the Jinchuriki he saved in the process. The sage reported. My information network confirmed the rumors that Akatsuki were planning on taking the Jinchuriki in order to extract the bijou for reasons yet unconfirmed. But it's highly likely they were planning on somehow harnessing the nine-tailed beast's power to take control of the elemental nations. And the rest of the organization? According to Sarutobi's students' past reports, there were 10 members and 5 confirmed dead, still left 5 powerful shinobi with unknown goals hiding somewhere among the nations. The one known as Pain and his partner have disappeared, not even other members of the group know where they've gone, and there's been no activity from either of them to suggest they're still active. Along with an unknown Nin, Uchiha Itachi and a shinobi referring to himself as Tobi are the only threat remaining. It was reassuring since Sarutobi knew Itachi was no threat to Konoha and would do his best to interfere with any attack on it without blowing his cover. The Uchiha's next report would no doubt have useful information in regards to how to handle the remaining 2 and how the Akatsuki is handling the massive blow to their numbers. With any luck, the older of the Uchiha brothers would be able to return home soon. What of the rumors of his befriending the Jinchuriki? It was clear the famed god of shinobi wanted to know if this man would pose a threat not only to Konoha, but to Naruto, who the man had come to think of as a surrogate grandson. All appear true. I've found nothing about him being anything but kind to them. He's found quite the following too. Both of Iwa's Jinchuriki, the Yambi and Gobi, as well as the Mizukage of the Sanbai respect him immensely, and consider him a great ally. Recent rumors are also saying he fixed the seal on Tsuna's Ichibi Jinchuriki, a boy Naruto's age. According to my source, the seal was incomplete, and the overexposure to the Ichibi's chakra was driving the kid insane. So he is proficient with seals. It was an indicator that the mystery shinobi was the Uzumaki he said he was, not a certainty of course, but it made it just a bit more likely. And the boy? How's he faring now? Apparently before this bounty hunter's interference the kid was killing pretty much anyone who looked at him funny. Suna was pretty much terrified of the kid. Now it seems he hasn't killed anyone since, and is making an effort to repair bonds with his family. And he's just doing this out of the kindness of his heart. What does he want? Why is he doing it? Kakashi sounded more stressed than reassured by the idea of this man helping the Jinchuriki. As far as I can tell, that's what it seems. The Kazekage offered him a sizable amount of money for helping his son, and he rejected it, and told him he'd be available if he needed anything else. The Mizukage even offered him a high-standing position in Kiri, and the only thing he wanted was for him to patch up things with his village. Everything Jiraiya had been able to dig up on the man just proved further that he was weird. No one was just that nice, even for someone who was taking down S-rank missing Nin like it was child's play. Is he truly an Uzumaki? The question of the hour. I won't know for sure unless I meet him, it was the truth. The red hair of pure Uzumakis varied, but Jiraiya knew from his interactions with several of them, even training one before, that no matter what shade it was always vibrant. Not like the dull, matte red of the Kazekage's son, Uzumaki red could go as deep as garnets, and still seem to shine as if it were one. It was fascinating, like many other aspects of the clan. Their longevity would make Guy jealous, and their natural proficiency with seals was like a bloodline on its own. He'd know especially quickly if the man held any close relation to Mito or Kushina, whom his godson had the closest blood relation to. I see, the professor mumbled around his pipe, smoke leaving his chapped lips. We'll call a meeting with the clan heads to discuss potentially offering this shinobi a place here in Konoha. If the motion carries, Jiraiya, you will track him down. I trust you to judge whether or not he is an Uzumaki, and whether or not he poses a threat to the village. If he passes your tests, you are to bring him here so I, as Hokage, can formally offer him a place in our village should he want it. And if he agrees? Both pale-haired active shinobi asked in synchrony. Should he agree to become a citizen of Konoha, he'll be subject to the same probation period as any other shinobi transferring villages. If, and only if, he passes that test will he be introduced to Naruto. Neither could argue with that tone even if they wanted to. Yes, Hokage-sama. Both shinobi bowed their heads at the order. A meeting with the clan heads will be held tomorrow morning. Do not be late. Dismissed. Kakashi wasn't late to the meeting, and if anyone was surprised by it, they didn't show it, not that he'd expected them to. Out of all the clan heads, Inuzuka-tsum was the most emotional, and even she hid them well the majority of the time. Aburame's Shibi was nearly robotic, and Hyuga Hayashi wasn't much better. The Inoshikacho trio were only ever emotional with their families and occasionally each other and few close friends, but all of them had lost far too much, as shinobi and as people, to allow themselves to be vulnerable. Especially given the topic of the meeting. Normally the council would also have to present for a meeting like this, but Kakashi knew exactly why the Sandaime kept them out of it. After Danzo's death nearly a year before and the subsequent discovery that Root had still been active, as well as knowing the elder's current opinion on Jinchuriki and sympathizers, it was decided that any matter that required absolute confidentiality would be handled only by the clan heads and anyone else the Hokage deemed trustworthy. They had been in charge of handling the Root operatives' reintegration into society, and placed in charge of making sure each of them got the help they needed. As a former Root and Umbu member, Kakashi's once subordinate Tenzu, now going by Yamato as a jonin of the village, had been placed in charge of a pair who considered themselves brothers. Kakashi was surprised he'd agreed after what he'd gone through and being forced to look at two constant reminders that it had still been going on. He seemed to enjoy it though, and the younger of the pair definitely needed the socialization. And some sunlight. Regardless, things seemed to flow much smoother without the elder's presence, since as soon as the name Uzumaki was uttered they tended to immediately explode with new ways of taking care of him. It was disgusting. Overall, when everything was said and done, if anyone had asked Kakashi, he'd say it went as well as it could have, given the circumstances. As always, Naro Shikaka was logical, pointing out potential political benefits as well as benefits for the village personally and emphasizing the fact that he was only going after Nuke-nin of the worst caliber. All of this was, of course, true, since the man was actually bringing peace to the hidden villages. Hyuga Hayashi had, of course, been hesitant. His long-standing grudge against Kyuubi was a sticking point, likely because of his own guilt, and would be a problem if an alliance between them was anything other than an advantage. Kakashi was just surprised he didn't fight the issue harder. Hayashi was so consumed by the clan it was shocking he cared about anything beyond that sometime. Though no one doubted he was anything but loyal, they knew that between Konoha and the Hyuga clan, he would always choose his clan. It was a double-edged sword since, while of course family was extremely important, protecting the village was why they were shinobi. The other clan heads seemed to have no strong opinions one way or the other, but Kakashi, Jiraiya and Hiruzen all knew they'd want to do their own form of interrogation. Despite their faith in their comrades, they weren't ones to take these kinds of risks without verifying things on their own, and it was a relief in many ways to all three men. It meant that, with more points of view, they'd have notes to compare in order to make the best decision. 4 hours of discussion was brief compared to other meetings they'd suffered through in the past, and everyone appeared to be in agreement. After confirming his identity, Konoha would offer its hand to the mysterious Nin who seemed to be a hero among the known Jinchuriki and, should he accept, be monitored until he proved no threat to Konoha's citizens, shinobi and resident Jinchuriki. Kakashi doubted he would be. Anyone who still wore their fallen village's Hittite was bound to be loyal, especially if he's truly an Uzumaki. They all in some way mentioned their worry about the man's strength and debated whether it would be worth the risk with their children. It was decided that, in the case that Jiraiya actually brought the man back to Konoha, it meant the youngest of the Sannin didn't believe he was a threat, though obviously he would be under constant watch to be sure. Jiraiya was a master at information gathering and infiltration, and it was highly unlikely someone half his age would be able to get anything past him. Especially since in both Jiraiya's and Kakashi's experience, Uzumakis were horrible liars, even if they did tend to exaggerate a lot. In the end they decided that Jiraiya was to leave in search of the bounty hunter 3 days from the date of the meeting. Once he found him he was to administer a test of his choosing, and in the event he passed, bring him to Konoha for an additional test, and be put under surveillance. Until they could be sure he wasn't a threat, he'd be watched by Umbu, and Kakashi knew the clan heads would likely be keeping their own eyes on the man as well. When the meeting adjourned, everyone went their separate ways, instructed not to tell anyone about the decision just yet. Should he join the village, Hiruzen hadn't wanted everyone to be any more suspicious than they already would be by the presence of a new shinobi joining the village. His name, luckily, wasn't widely known among civilians, and most shinobi that Kakashi knew seemed to think the man was good anyway. Besides, if he wasn't a threat, he wouldn't be under suspicion for longer than necessary. Kakashi was torn between hoping the man would come, if only for the sake of having one more connection to Kushina and her son, and wanting nothing to do with him, to avoid the reminder as much as he could. Jiraiya's first stop on his search for the mysterious bounty hunter was Suna. Since Suna and Konoha were allies, no matter how tentative their relationship had been as of late, it would be the easiest place to get information since he wouldn't need a disguise or any infiltration techniques. He met his informant at a bar, sitting in a back booth that faced away from the commotion of drunkards and exasperated bartenders. He was a short man, older than Jiraiya, and had been close to the Kazekage family and the woman who sealed the Ichibi, Chio. Yuzashio Nin? You mean Kira-san? It was the first time Jiraiya had heard a given name, and, even if he learned nothing else from this visit, he at least had a place to start. He wasn't here for long, seemed real concerned with helping Garasama, but he was nice. Showed no fear, even when the kid tried to kill him with his sand. Had just as much hair as you, Jiraiya, deep red not to mention pale. I don't think he got a wink of sleep the entire time he was here. Kid looked like he was a veteran in a war, all scars and wary, not to mention his eyes. He's definitely been through the ringer. Real quiet too. The only time I saw him smile genuinely the whole time he was here was when he was talking to Garasama. Things have been different around here ever since. Different how? He'd heard that the Ichibi's Jinchuriki, Gaara, had been driven murderous by the beast's influence, but surely a new seal couldn't swap the kid's personality. Garasama smiles more, seemed real taken with Kira-san. Even asked him to come back and visit in his own roundabout way. You'd never think he was capable of cold-blooded murder if you saw him now, and while parents round here are still wary of letting their kids play with him, he does seem to have a better relationship with his family. Jiraiya got the distinct impression that it was probably something no one expected, since rumors about Gaara stated that the kid liked and trusted no one, not even his family. It was interesting. Kid must have said something to Yandame Kazekage-sama too, because even he seemed lighter. Still not quite the way he'd been before his wife, but better. Since then everyone else seems a bit lighter too. Anything else you can tell me about this, Kiru? Because while what the kid has done for Suna was plenty interesting, it was not why he was here. If he could just find something that could tell him where to go next, this whole thing could proceed so much faster. He was reluctant to mention his last name, if that means anything. Said something about the Uzumaki being feared by a few different places and being taught to keep it hidden. Guess there's still some fear there after Yuzashio went down. I think it's part of the reason Garasama was so taken with him. It's nice being understood. When was he last in the village? Because tracking him from Suna was doable, but not going to be a short or fun trip if it's been too long. Kid visited young Garasama about 2 weeks ago, said something about needing to be home for an anniversary or something. Bingo. Thank you for your time, Jiraiya-san. I think I have everything I need to go from here. The Toad Sage concluded the meeting quickly, not wanting to waste any time. It was no trouble, Jiraiya, safe travels. They nodded to each other in acknowledgement, and parted ways. As soon as his informant had said the words, Jiraiya knew where he had to go. If his hunch was correct, the man would be in the ruins of Yuzushiogakure no Sato. The 18th anniversary of the village's destruction would be in days, and if Jiraiya didn't make it by then, there would be no telling where the bounty hunter would be after that. Normally a trip from Suna to the island that used to be Whirlpool Country would have been nearly a week walking, but determination carried Jiraiya far. The youngest of the Sannin was there in 3 days, arriving late into the night, moments before the date of the once great Yuzushiogakures fall. There was hardly anything left. Buildings had been trashed, crumbled into pieces, or gone with no trace. The years of abandonment left what little paint that was left among the rubble, once bright greens and blues and oranges, reds and whites, now chipped and dull, bleached away from the light of the sun. Years of rain had undoubtedly washed away the blood that had once littered the streets, and Konoha, as its once ally, had buried the dead while the survivors of the fall scattered. Even in absolute ruin, the village that had once been known for its sealing practices was beautiful. A ghost town with so much history and such amazing shinobi. The Shodame Hokage's wife and the Yandames both hailed from this village, and even if Jiraiya's godson never got to see or experience it, it was his heritage as well. He wandered the broken, empty streets of the village until dawn, looking for the bounty hunter, to no avail. If he was there, then he was hiding, but it was more likely that he wasn't, which meant that there was another home and another anniversary somewhere else. That was what he thought, at least, until he made it to the center of the village, home to a great fountain with beautifully carved men and women commanding the sea. It was mostly crumbled by now, and the once pearlescent white of the statue was now mostly brown and green with dirt and moss and algae, but what interested the toad sage most was the person sitting on the nearly untouched part of the fountain. He was perched on the edge of the once glorious fountain and heart of Uzushio, legs crossed and meditating, not moving an inch. It could mean a few things: that he didn't consider Jiraiya a threat, that he wasn't aware of the toad sage's presence, though he doubted it, no S-rank shinobi would be that unaware of his surroundings, ever, or simply that he didn't attack without first being provoked. He was thinner than most healthy shinobi, with his cheekbones sharp and cheeks drawn in just slightly too much, but it was more than clear that he was toned and strong. There were deep purple rings beneath his eyes that, despite being closed, seemed to droop. He didn't sleep much, maybe a couple hours a night at most, and his diet was poor. Jiraiya wondered if it was simply the result of hunting S-rank shinobi or if it were something else. He didn't seem armed though, so perhaps he wasn't planning on a fight. The white-haired man tried not to be grateful for it. His clothes brought Jiraiya back to the old, classic Uzushio he'd seen on one of his first travels and hung loosely on the man's body. He was wearing typical black shinobi pants with bandages wrapped around his right thigh and up his ankles and soles of his feet, and dipped under his black shinobi sandals. His top and jacket both dyed with colors typical of Uzushio Nin back in when it was at its best. Over 3/4 sleeve fishnet armor he wore a mid-sleeve, kimono-style shirt, dyed deep teal almost black in the dark shade with red-orange uzumaki spirals on each shoulder. It was fastened loosely, exposing his fishnet-covered chest, just below his ribs, with a surprisingly clean off-white obi belt that was trimmed with blue scrolls like the sky at high noon and the sea at night. His hitai hung from his neck. Jiraiya wondered if he ever used it as a headband to keep his thick bangs from falling in his face. His long hair, tied tight in a high ponytail with long bangs framing his face, was the color of old blood, not quite dry but darker than what it looked like fresh. The kind that was thick and tacky. Darker than Kushina's had been, much darker, and more vibrant than Mito's had been in her youth. It reminded him of a student he'd had only longer. The reds of garnets in the sun clashed with the moon-pale shade of his skin and the silvery pink scars covering it. He could barely see them against the light tone of his skin, but they were there, a few across his face, a thick one going down his neck, hiding behind his hitai, and a few scattered across what parts of his arms and chest were visible. More than the scars, though, were the seals that were tattooed over his skin, peeking out from under his clothing. Some appeared to be storage seals modified to work over the flesh of his body, and others made less sense. They were drawn over his arms, ending just before his wrist, and he could barely see some over his chest and likely over his stomach as well. Seeing seals on people was nothing new to Jiraiya per se, but a storage seal placed anywhere but a sealing scroll was unheard of because it wasn't supposed to be done, wasn't supposed to be possible. Appearances alone already determined that the man before him with the Uzushio hitai around his neck and garnet red hair was most likely an Uzumaki, and Jiraiya briefly wondered if any of the seals that had been suited specifically to Uzumaki blood had survived the destruction. "You know," the man suddenly spoke, voice rough but not too deep in pitch, and Jiraiya stiffened slightly. "It's rude to stare." His tone was light, but it was disconcerting nonetheless. It was only now that Jiraiya noticed his pale eyelids were now shaded orange and yellow that complemented his hair nicely, and he nearly choked because how had he not noticed that he'd been gathering nature energy? He rose from his seat on the fountain, hair hanging just above the backs of his knees, and he opened his eyes. Orange gold irises peered between his shaded lids as he readjusted to the light of the sun, and his distinctly square pupils seemed to stare through Jiraiya. "I'm guessing you want an explanation then." Jiraiya could only sputter because what? The man, sage, sighed deeply and released his sage mode. The oranges and yellows that shaded his eyelids faded, and when he reopened his eyes they were medium blue-violet, and seemed to shine brighter than what should have been possible for such a color. Faded by war and pain, but so, completely alive. Jiraiya nodded his head shakily, torn between anger and shock, and the man beamed at him before turning to walk to one of the last remaining buildings in the village ruins. "Come on." Jiraiya followed the redhead into the musty, barely standing remains of a building that had once held an underground library and record room. He was wary to trust him, mapping out ways to escape in case of an ambush or collapse, but followed silently. He bit into his thumb and unsealed the door leading to the hidden room, something only one with Uzumaki blood could do, and entered with Jiraiya not far behind as he made his way deep into the underground tunnels of Uzushio. What the hell is happening here? The jump hadn't been painful. The light was bright, and he was unconscious before he could really feel anything. Waking up likely would have been painful in the past, but years of barely having enough time or chakra to heal and constantly being injured desensitized him to most physical pain these days. He was in a forest, surrounded by trees and brush, and it was alive. He could hear animals and moving water. As far as they'd known, the elemental nations had been reduced to ash, so any kind of life, even if it wasn't human, there was no way for him to know if he'd been teleported through space or time or both. If it had worked, there was no way for him to tell how far back he was, and if it didn't, he had no way of knowing where he was. It would remain a mystery until he found something. A single shinobi. A village. Anything. He stood shakily, bracing himself on a tree as his muscles decided to loosen and work properly. There was no way for Naruto to know how long he'd been laying on the forest floor, but from the impression his body had left in the grass and the ache in his muscles, he guessed it was a while. Likely a few days. The lack of activity in his mindscape was also telling. So much chakra had gone into the seal, it was a wonder he didn't have to draw energy from star alignments or something, and the bijas sealed within him seemed out for the count. At least for the time being. Being alone wasn't a new concept to Naruto, but after not being alone and isolated for over 12 years, it was hard to stomach. Here he was truly alone. Everyone was dead, the versions he knew and had grown with were, at least, and he didn't even have the bijou to keep him company. They were still there, he could feel them clearly, but they were all so chakra exhausted it was a wonder any of them survived at all. He was grateful to them for that, since they're probably the reason he'd lived to end up wherever he was. But they weren't awake, he couldn't talk to them or really do anything beyond watch them as they regained chakra. Shoving down his emotional angst, no doubt Kurama would have something to say about it later, likely in a desperate attempt to get him to crack a smile. No matter how much he denied it, he pressed forward. He had to figure out not only where he was but when he was as well. Since he'd been passed out for what was probably days and no one had taken him prisoner or killed him, it was safe to assume he wasn't particularly close to any village, or at the very least, he'd been teleported to a location that had managed to avoid entirely. He treaded carefully, hyper-aware of everything around him. He wasn't in sage mode, but that didn't mean he couldn't still feel everything. It was something he'd gotten good at during the war, since having time to sit completely still to gather nature chakra wasn't always an option. Being able to sense negative emotion helped too. It was something that had proven helpful against Madara and the Kyuubi, though it became less necessary when their enemy was on a path of destruction and never slept. He wandered for days before realizing he was on an island and not a peninsula, and when he'd stumbled across a village, ruins overgrown and sun-bleached, he'd felt like he died inside because everything was still destroyed. When he looked closer, taking the time to notice the once bright colors and prominent Uzumaki spiral on torn flags and faded from broken buildings, he managed to find an ounce of hope that maybe there was a chance. As far anyone in his time had known, Yuzushigakure and the island the ruined village rested on had sunk into the sea as a result of the rabbit goddess's wrath. Yet here it was, still destroyed, but here. He'd never been able to visit the remains of his mother's village before the war. Jiraiya had planned to take him, likely after the man finally told him about his parents. However, he had no doubt the man would have done it eventually. It was beautiful, even in ruins, and he couldn't help but wish that he was experiencing it with the pervy sage himself. When all the past Hokage had been resurrected, he'd learned that he was supposed to learn the truth about his family when he turned 16. Jiraiya had died months before his birthday, and he'd ended up learning about his parentage before then anyway, when he'd almost released Kurama in his fit of rage when he'd fought pain. Naruto didn't think he'd ever truly known anger until Jiraiya's death, now that he'd thought about it. He'd felt the sadness that came from overwhelming loneliness, likely better than most people ever could. He'd felt the frustration at being overlooked and hated, at everyone thinking they were superior and that he was some kind of demon. But anger, true anger without even Kurama's influence, hadn't been something he'd ever felt before. Especially not at someone he'd considered family. When Tsunade had told him about the Toad Sage's death, he'd never been so angry at another person. Not Sasuke, or the villagers, or anyone. The anger and grief Jiraiya's death had caused was beyond anything he'd ever felt before. It was incapacitating, and only support from Iruka had been enough to get him back up again. He was doing his best not to allow himself to fall back into that spiral of grief. To control his emotions better so he could fix this. But after so much loss, it was hard not to allow himself to go numb. Now, at least, he could finally say he understood just what Sasuke and Kakashi had been feeling when they'd experienced their own losses. His heart panged at the reminder, that brief kiss with Sasuke flashing through his mind, and the dam finally broke. Tears flowed down his face like rivers as he remembered every single one of his fallen comrades. Good times and bad flashed through his mind, and his knees buckled beneath him, and he just sobbed. Blood-red hairs stuck to his pale, wet skin as he wept for the first time since he was 15 and lost Jiraiya. Crying wouldn't bring back those he lost, he knew. It wouldn't help him save anyone faster or take the pain away, But that didn't mean that finally letting go of nearly 10 years of grief didn't feel good. It felt like hours, just sitting there in the middle of rubble weeping, saying the names of those he'd lost like a broken record as he remembered every second he'd known them. In some ways it felt like a weight off his shoulders, his emotions no longer weighing him down like an anchor to the ocean floor, but in other ways he'd felt worse. If this had worked, then the people he'd known and loved and fought beside were gone, and would never exist, and to try to delude himself into thinking that seeing them again alive and not caught in a war wouldn't destroy him all over again would be pointless. But despite that, forgetting who they'd been was something he would never be able to do. Even if he did go back to Konoha and have to face the young, inexperienced children they were now, he wouldn't let himself forget the ones who died for him. He couldn't. Not after this. Eventually, Naruto didn't know how long it had been. His sobs were reduced to snivels and his legs began once again supporting his weight. The tears stopped flowing and he pressed on, looking for anything that could help him. He was too weak to defeat anything as he was, wouldn't be able to do any real damage until he and the Bijou recovered their chakra, and was almost entirely unarmed. Supplies began running low not long before the jump, and nearly everything they'd had left had been given to him. Unfortunately, most of it was damaged or dull. It had been barely enough to get by at war and would never hold up outside of it. Not when Akatsuki was still out there and Nuke Nin could find him at any given moment. Through days of searching the ruins of Uzushio-gakure, Naruto found a number of things. The first was a sealed door in what was once the Uzumaki clan compound. The seal was easy enough to figure out, and his Uzumaki blood was all he needed to release it. The tunnel the door revealed was long and dark and led to his second discovery. A huge library filled with Uzumaki secrets, techniques, everything he never had the chance to learn and everything his mother never finished learning before being brought to Konoha. He spent hours looking through the scrolls and books, made copies and notes of several things, but was never able to find anything on the Uzumaki ever accomplishing time travel through seals. He found information on Uzumaki-style taijutsu, kenjutsu, fuinjutsu, and even found ninjutsu techniques created and utilized by the Uzumaki alone. It was fascinating, and Naruto spent hours learning his clan's secrets, and days after that perfecting them. Shadow clones were difficult to maintain at first, but his chakra slowly returned and he was able to learn decades worth of techniques and history in a number of weeks. The last thing he found was a silver Hittite plate, stamped with the Uzumaki spiral and symbol of Uzushio. Naruto unsealed his Hittite from his arm. He couldn't risk wearing it in case he was caught, and carefully removed the leaf-stamped plate. He resealed the plate that had come from his surrogate brother's forehead protector, the only thing he had left of the first man to change and truly see him for who he was and not the fox sealed within him. After, he carefully slotted the Uzushio plate into place before tying it on like a headband to keep his long bangs out of his eyes. It was the first step in establishing his new identity. Shikaku was the first of the Bijou within him to wake up. He was grumpy and protective, but Naruto was unable to solidly confirm anything, much to the Tanuki's chagrin. By then, at least, Naruto had finally gathered enough strength to survive with only Sasuke's sword, taijutsu and a few ninjutsu he could manage without chakra exhaustion. While looking throughout the village, he noticed several Uzushio artifacts had been missing, kenjutsu scrolls that had been in the Uzukage's office building. From his own time, he knew that Kumo had been majorly behind the raid, and he briefly wondered if just going up to the Reikage and demanding such things back would work. It likely wouldn't, and he ended up deciding that sneaking in and stealing it back would work better. It took him another week of preparations before he was ready to leave. Before he left the ruins of Uzushio-gakure, after finally washing off years of grim, despite not having soap, he looked in the water, the closest thing he had to looking in a mirror in years, and saw himself for the first time since the resealing of Kurama and the others. The first thing he thought of, upon seeing himself, was that he looked more like his mother than he ever had before. When he'd first met her, her chakra impression, he'd found out that he'd inherited her face. His head, cheekbone, nose and mouth shapes had all come from her and her clan. His hair was a darker red than his mother's and Mitosama's had been, but the color was no less vibrant. It made him look like a true, pure Uzumaki and would work well for his cover. His eyes were no longer as bright a blue as they'd once been, settling on a clear blue-violet, and his skin was no longer as tan as it had been before. His whisker marks had scarred over. The pink marks were barely visible through the pale of his skin. He found several scars, actually, from wounds even the Bijou couldn't heal, and the one Kurama had refused to heal completely. It was new, since Kurama, before the war, had never left him injured for long. In some ways it was relieving to see that there was no way for a random shinobi to say that they were the same person. He looked different enough that even if he and the Naruto from this time stood side by side, there was a clear distinction between them. No one could argue that they were anything but family, and that's how it needed to be. But losing his identity, his hair color, skin tone and eye color had come from his father, and now he had none of them. It hurt more than he'd expected to actually see it, and the fact that he'd soon be forced to abandon the final connection to the man he'd considered his hero when he was a child and to his mask, Jiraiya, his name. When Obito had sent him and Sakura to the fake world, losing his name had hurt because his name had become his identity. He was Uzumaki Naruto, but he couldn't be. Not anymore. It was the major reason for choosing the name he did. Kiryu. Frog. Both his father and his master had been toad summoners, and it was the closest he'd get to keeping that connection. The name had been Shikamaru's idea, part of the many plans they'd laid out before completing the seal, and he was grateful. When he finally left the fallen village, he was no longer Uzumaki Naruto, shinobi of Konoha. He left as Uzumaki Kiryu, one of the last shinobi loyal to Uzushio. Before he could do anything, though, he needed money, and after a week of doing the equivalent of C and D ranked missions for non-shinobi villages, he finally could pay for proper clothes and weapons. It was the first reassurance that he'd gone back far enough to stop the war, but it wouldn't be proof until he saw something that could measure the time. He commissioned his clothes to look like proper Uzushio clothes, loose and flowy like water and a mix of neutral and cool colors. His fishnet armor didn't do much besides interrupt the view of his seals, but over that he donned a dark teal kimono shirt with red-orange spirals on the sleeves and bound with a pearl-white obi that was trimmed with gold and blue scrolls, big enough to cover Kurama's seal. His right thigh was bandaged over his tight but flexible gray-black shinobi pants, and his shins were bandaged beneath the black open-heel shinobi sandals that covered his feet. Each part of his outfit carefully chosen to appear to be an Uzushio native. He'd taken to painting his nails too. It was a small luxury, something he hadn't done before the war, but after years of living in cramped bunkers, rarely able to clean himself properly, he wanted to enjoy everything he could. They were most frequently painted black, but every once in a while he tried to add color as well. When he was finally back on his feet, both in terms of chakra and money, he was off in search of anything to give him even a sliver more of an advantage against Toby. His Kamui was a problem, even if they'd eventually figured it out, but without the others there to assist him it would be a challenge. If Kiryu could find anything in the missing Uzushio artifacts that could help him, he'd be in a better place. Before he did anything, though, he checked up on Konoha. Kiryu stayed a good distance away at first, somewhere he had a clear view of the four heads on the Hokage mountain. Hashirama, Tobirama, Hiruzen and Minato. No Tsunade. That meant, at least, that the Chunin exams hadn't occurred yet. When he'd gotten closer, careful to keep his presence hidden through a mix of specially designed seals and chakra masking, he'd seen himself wearing brown shorts and an orange vest and bolted out of there. He was young, maybe 8 or 9 at the most, and as much as he would have loved to give his younger self what he always wanted, a family, his first priority was preventing the fourth, and last, great shinobi war. Before leaving, after night fell over his home village, Kiryu snuck into Danzo's home. The man was a threat, and no matter how much he thought what he was doing was best, it most certainly was not, and the elder was dangerous to Naruto and the village. The seal he placed was slow-acting, something that would poison him over time, and as cruel as Kiryu felt for doing it, he couldn't stick around to kill the man quickly. If it looked like a murder, there would be even more suspicions within the village. At least this way they could play it off as natural. It took a week to leave him completely bedridden, and if Kiryu also blew the lid off of the root foundation, that was his secret. After that he headed to the larger villages who had once had it out for Uzushio, who'd feared them and their power. In the end he'd been mostly sneaky enough to avoid getting caught, but despite his efforts, he'd inadvertently made himself the subject of many rumors, mostly starting from Kumo, where he'd been seen for the first time. They never found out his given name, but word of his surname, and what he'd been doing spread quickly. His hair, in all the styles he'd learned to keep it manageable, had become what he was known by. Blood red and longer than what most shinobi would be comfortable with. Enemies fought dirty, and long hair was an easy target when you weren't constantly aware of it. Kiryu had decided to keep it long when Kakashi had told him just how much it had made him look like his mother. He told her once that he'd wished his hair was like hers, and despite how much he missed the sunny blonde hair he'd grown up with, he'd never found something so superficial so useful. Had his hair been the bright blonde of his father, he might not have gotten as far with Kumo, as he had not to mention what Iwa and Kiri would do if they thought there was another Namikaze. There was a reason why Naruto was never given his father's name after their deaths. After months of searching, he'd gotten out with scrolls and books, most of which contained information he already knew, and he'd only ever been more frustrated when he was forced to deal with Sasuke and Sai when he was a kid. The little information that had been new wasn't anything that could help him against something as powerful as Obito's Sharingan. He became a bounty hunter almost a year after his jump to the past. It wasn't something he'd done on purpose, especially with a fierce nickname like the Bloody Whirlpool. It was awesome, but Kiryu had really only been trying to be a good Samaritan. It was their fault for ambushing him. The fact that those first kills had been a pair of immortals was the real reason for the name, though most assumed it was his hair. Kiryu wasn't entirely sure that it wasn't. Kiryu had been prepared to leave Yugakure to make his way back to Kumo when familiar black cloaks covered with red clouds appeared before him. Faced with the zombie combo, Kiryu remembered Asuma and what the two of them had done to him, and what his death had done to Shikamaru and his teammates. There was no way around a bloody battle. In order to kill Kakuzu, he needed to take down all of his hearts, and Haiden had to be dismembered to remove the threat. Fighting them had been easier than he remembered it, and if Kiryu had been unaware of his strength, he might have wondered why everyone had so much trouble dealing with them. They were S-rank nin for a reason, but Kiryu had taken down stronger opponents in the past, and had faced a war worse than any of them had ever seen. They were nothing. Kakuzu had been the first to go down. The pair worked well together, but they were no match for Kiryu's prowess with his clones, and Kakuzu's hearts were quick to stop under their overwhelming numbers. Haiden had proved slightly more difficult. Shikamaru had dealt with him in his time, and he never really knew much about him. He ended up throwing some well-aimed Saban to paralyze him and, after removing his head, slapped a number of exploding tags on his body and blew it up. He buried the pieces across Steam Country and took his head, still screaming and cursing, back to the village. His reasoning for returning their heads to their villages was so word of their deaths would spread, to alleviate some of the fear their threat created. Haiden's head wouldn't survive for long without blood flow, oxygen or food and water, and even if it did, a head was hardly a threat. The men at the desk looked a bit green as they took the head, and a good look at his bloody clothes, but brought it to their prison quickly. The money he received, while it wasn't something he'd thought about when bringing it back, was significant. More than anything, he'd managed to make taking freelance missions and much more aligned with his goal. It was also much less tedious than escorts, and Kiryu always loved a challenge, though he still hadn't quite decided to go after the rest of them yet. Going all the way to Taki to return a head hadn't been fun, but it had given him an accidental in with one of the Jinchuriki. Knowing Taki was the village of Komiai's last Jinchuriki, he'd felt obligated to make sure the village was aware of the threat the Akatsuki posed to her. When he'd met her in his own time, she'd been about his height and a year or so older, so seeing the mid-haired girl so young when he was nearly 26 was strange. He'd felt obligated to help in some way, as a Jinchuriki and as a human. He promised to protect her and the others like her from them. Before he left, he encouraged her to become a great shinobi and told her he'd see her again. He wasn't sure when, but he would. And if he gave the leader of Fu's village a small talking to about how to properly treat a Jinchuriki before heading out, that was between them. He didn't end up going to Kumo until much later, and when he did, his stay was brief. He'd found something of an ally in Killer Bee, and both he and Gyuki nearly cried when they saw him again for the first time in years. They wouldn't become actual friends until his next visit, not that he knew it at the time, but just seeing him alive had been good enough for Kiryu. Deidara and Sasori were next. The fight was quick, and despite Kiryu's reluctance to kill the blonde teen, he knew it had to be done. Forced to join or not, Deidara was loyal and a threat to Gaara. Nothing he could say or offer him at this point would change his mind. He made sure it was painless and told the Tsuchikage as much. Anoki hadn't been happy with him, but in the end he'd understood. Kiryu also warned of the danger the group posed to the Jinchuriki, and to make sure that until the threat is taken care of, they stay safe. He hadn't said anything about Konoha, but he hoped that, in getting the countries to band together against the Akatsuki, it would start to change things. Nothing anyone did could ever fix the problems between them, but they could move past it if they wanted to. If they truly wanted peace, they'd at least try. He'd said as much before leaving. Sasori had proved to be more of a challenge, if only through his own fear of death, but the man was no match for Kiryu's determination to protect Gaara. Nothing the man did was enough to drag the battle out beyond a few minutes. It was something he'd wanted to do since their mission to rescue Gaara when he returned from training. This man's grandmother had sealed Shikaku within him improperly, and he'd been a part of the duo that had taken him and killed him. This Gaara wouldn't go through that, he was sure, and this Chiyo would be given a chance to rectify herself in a way that wasn't suicide. When he went to Suna to turn in Sasori of the Red Sands head, he made sure to let Chiyo know personally. She'd lashed out at him, and Kira brought up her history with Suna's Jinchuriki. He made up an excuse for knowing it, and when he told her what Sasori and the rest of the organization was planning on doing with the bijou, she'd relented. Kira understood, probably better than most at this point, the loss she felt. Konoha's White Fang had killed her son and daughter-in-law, and now he'd taken her last connection to them. She only had her brother. He didn't like it, but it had to be done. He would have loved if there'd been another way, but with only 6 members left, he couldn't let it stop him. Meeting Gaara again had been more painful than he would have liked. He lost him twice, and the older redhead had been the first person to truly understand the pain he'd faced his entire life. He would have liked to leave, changing him to his counterpart, to give them the bond he and his Gaara shared. He couldn't just leave Gaara, lonely and unloved, to suffer until then, not after actually seeing him. Flashbacks flooded his mind. Meeting him with Konohamaru and his team, his fight with Lee, the altercation at the hospital, their fight in the forest, and every interaction after that. When they finally became friends, when he died, when the ex-Jinchuriki tried to forgive Sasuke for him, how he'd saved him when Kurama was extracted, how he died for him, how they couldn't bring him back. It was a lot for one look into his young, guarded and deadly teal eyes. "What are you looking at?" It had been worded as a question but was clearly a demand. When he'd taken too long to answer, the sand came flying at him. Kira didn't flinch, barely even blinked. He didn't show any fear because no matter how dangerous Gaara was, there was no way for him to actually hurt him. Kira was too powerful for Gaara to ever actually win, but he'd never do anything to hurt the Suna Jinchuriki, ever. He raised a hand and the sand around him formed a wall, effectively blocking Gaara's attack. It wasn't something he could naturally do like Gaara could. Truth be told, it had been his first time actually using it, but it was something Shikaku's presence had gifted him with. He knew it would be enough to make Gaara pause, even if it took a few blocks for him to truly see. The boy, eyes wide and filled with frustration, shot more sand at him, and civilians looked at the scene in horror, but Kiru ignored them. "I understand, you know." He didn't need to explain what Gaara clearly knew. Kiru's sand fell and Gaara's froze. The pain of loneliness and loss and the hatred that it breeds was something both redheads were intimately familiar with. Even though Kiru had never had his village try to assassinate him, that he knew of, the scorn had and discrimination had hurt more than any physical pain he'd ever experienced. He wasn't quite sure what he could say here, surrounded by all the spectators, that could help him emotionally, but he knew how to help him physically. "Your seal, I can feel his chakra bleeding through. I can help you if you'd like. You'd never have to worry about him taking over in your sleep again." He spoke softly and smiled painfully. He'd missed Gaara so much, and even if this Gaara was never Kazekage, he could still be the great shinobi he'd become in Kira's time. The distrust that poured off Gaara was so thick it was nearly palpable, and Kira knew the only way to convince the boy to let him would be to make him understand. "There's an organization called the Akatsuki, made up of S-rank missing nin, currently planning on extracting the 9 bijou from their hosts. Today I turned in the head of the 4th member I've taken out in order to keep the 9 of you safe, and to save the entire shinobi world, but that wouldn't matter much to Gaara as he was. As a Fuinjutsu master and a descendant of the first Jinchuriki, I know better than most that what you contain doesn't define you. Being a Jinchuriki doesn't make you a monster or unlovable." Kira took a deep breath as he continued, and he could see Gaara waver. "Right now the quality and state of your seal is driving him crazy, which is driving you crazy. I can fix it so neither of you are bothered anymore. Who knows, you may even learn to work together at some point." "Why would you do that for someone who just tried to kill you?" He'd fallen to his knees, and it was clear he was trying so hard to resist, out of fear of the betrayal that could come after, like all the times before. "I've always believed people deserved a chance for redemption. My best friend abandoned everything in search of power, and I fought tooth and nail to get him back. Everyone told me it was too late for him, but somehow I managed to get through anyway. I was able to turn so many of my enemies into some of my closest friends. You're young and yes, you've killed, but you have your entire life ahead of you, and the power you have can also save people if you wanted to." Kira had spent his entire life wanting very few things. He'd wanted a family, he'd wanted acknowledgement, and he'd wanted to be able to help people. Never had he ever wished the pain of loneliness he'd suffered on anyone else, even if he wished they'd understood, and he knew Gaara had wanted many of the same things. Even if he was too scared to ask for them, too scared of the betrayal he could face for trusting them. "Can you really help?" Kira had never seen Gaara looking so much like a child, and it hurt. He offered the raccoon-eyed boy a pale hand. "Of course." He ended up fixing Gaara's seal and his relationship with his siblings. Perhaps it was because he was an adult, someone strong that trusted Gaara wouldn't hurt him, but the 10-year-old seemed to cling. It was precious. The boy had asked that he be there when he apologized to his brother and sister, and actually opened up to him. The Shikaku inside Kira was angry with himself, that he prevented Gaara from having a normal childhood, and that despite that, this Gaara didn't hold it against him. They talked about their pasts, and Kira dropped a few hints to solidify his cover story of being an Uzumaki. He couldn't say that he was a Jinchuriki, but he could empathize with him in the way Gaara had needed since his uncle tried to kill him. Gaara told him about his childhood, and Kira offered to teach him how to properly forge a partnership between himself and his bijou when he was ready, and about proper bonds, and when he had to leave Gaara had nearly begged that he stay. Kira had changed the way people saw him, changed him, and he finally found someone who never looked at Gaara with anything other than fondness, even if it was pained at times. It was the first time Kira had actually wanted to stay anywhere since seeing his counterpart, but he couldn't, and the sadness on Gaara's face was heartbreaking. Instead of staying, he agreed to visit as often as he could, as long as the redhead agreed to try to fix things with his father. He warned that it may take a while, but he would be back. He never went back on his word, after all. Gaara smiled for what was probably the first time in years and Kira grinned back. Just like he did with Fu, Kira spoke to the Kazekage, Raza, about making Gaara a weapon. He wasn't sure if he actually had gotten through to the man enough to prevent his eventual alliance with Orochimaru, but it would have to be enough. At the very least, he hoped he would actually try to be a father to his youngest son. With a sad goodbye to the Sand siblings, Kira left Suna to begin tracking down the next pair of Akatsuki agents. When he decided to remove the Akatsuki agents individually, Kira had already known that killing Nagato, Konan and Itachi was out of the question. Hearing the truth about the Uchiha massacre from Itachi's mouth, hearing the love he so clearly had for his brother, and for his village made the thought impossible. He knew, though, that the older brother of his once best friend was sick, fatally so. He hoped Tsunade would be able to save him, even if it really only prolonged the inevitable long enough for Sasuke to learn the truth before he regretted it. If not, he hoped he could do it. When he killed Kisame, Kira only narrowly managed to dodge Itachi. He refused to fight the Uchiha more than absolutely necessary, to kill him, or even injure him too severely. The team wouldn't let him get a word in, but it didn't matter, he had no doubt he'd see him again. He removed the fishman's head and quickly sealed it and Samahata away before getting out of there. Itachi had been known as the Uchiha genius for a reason, and regardless of the advantage Kira had, he would not kill an innocent man over something like this. It was only when he returned the head and sword to Kiri did Isabu kindly remind him that Obito had Yagura, the Mizukage and the Sanbai Jinchuriki, under a genjutsu. That the masked Uchiha's manipulations were the reason for Kiri's state of upheaval. Breaking Obito's hold on Yagura was easy, but explaining everything had taken much longer. He was Kira's age, despite his looks, and understood and handled it better than most would have, but the situation wasn't ideal. His village hated him, more than they already had because of Isabu, because of a maniac seeking world domination. It was clear that Kiri was skeptical of the explanation. They had no reason to trust the stranger who'd come to the village with a severed head and believing Yagura after everything seemed out of the question. The Mizukage was determined and made a deal. He'd remain Mizukage long enough to clean up the mess Obito had made, and after that he'd pass the hat down. He'd asked that they only give him a chance, and had bowed to them. The citizens of Kiri agreed, and Yagura was grateful enough for Kira's help that he'd offered him citizenship. The Uzumaki declined. He wasn't sure he'd ever settle down in a village. If he did, it would be Konoha, but he wasn't going to say that. But he was grateful for the invitation and offered his services whenever they were necessary, as long as the request didn't interfere with his goal. Not everyone in Kiri was convinced or happy, but the civil war subsided for the time being, and Yagura worked hard to earn the trust of his village. Both Kira and Isabu were proud to see that he wouldn't fall victim to the Akatsuki again. The AIM orphans were last. It had taken Kira months to find them, and he'd almost forgotten that Nagato was currently crippled. They were both stubborn, and after hours of trying to convince them that this Akatsuki would only end badly, that Nagato was family however distant and that this wouldn't help the world find peace, he got fed up. It wasn't something he'd wanted to use here, or on them. Especially after they'd taken so long to write out, but he was frustrated and didn't think it through. Kira slapped the memory seals on each of them and pushed just enough chakra into them to show Pain's assault on Konoha, his death, the war that followed, and finally they understood. He'd released the 6 paths of pain, and Jiraiya had believed that Nagato's Rinnegan would save the world, and the Toads had referred to the pair of them as the children of prophecy, so Kira decided to trust them. So long as Obito didn't get his hands on them, they would be fine, but he was able to give him something else. He had a clone gather sage chakra while he explained as best as he was able what he was going to do, showing them the sun seal placed on his palm. They still looked skeptical despite him showing them the potential future. When Kira released the clones and accepted the sage chakra into his body, his eyes turning orange and pupils turning toad square with orange and yellow rings around them, before activating the power the Rikuda's Sannin had gifted him. His square pupils were divided by a slitted one, and the pigment surrounding his eyes vanished. Kira would have preferred to be in one of his Kyuubi cloaks for the added power, but with Kurama still passed out despite nearly 18 months of sleep, though he could tell he'd be waking up soon, it wasn't an option. He was confident he'd be able to help him enough without the fox's help, though he'd have liked to push it further. He pressed his right palm, with the white seal, over Nagato's heart, and he felt his chakra meet the Akatsuki leaders and balance. Kira wasn't a healer, not like Tsunade and Sakura had been, and he may not be able to give Nagato the mobility he'd once had, but he could give him something, and that was enough. He was no longer dying, no longer so physically unhealthy that he looked like he was dying, and in time with some physical therapy he'd be able to stand on his own as well. You need to hide, get as far away as you can until I can take care of Obito, because as long as he's out there and you're here, your eyes are in danger, he told him. After that I'll help you figure out anything you want to do. If you want to see Jiraiya or go back to AIM or whatever, I'll help. Just remember what I told you about healing and keep yourselves and your eyes safe. All he had left after that was to plan what to do with Obito and kill Orochimaru. Itachi would hopefully see his chance for redemption by then. Before he did anything though, Kira decided to keep his promises. He started off in Taki to visit Fu, and when he left, through Steam Country he heard rumors that a certain pervert was apparently hunting for a bounty hunter. Kira wasn't sure how to feel about that. He hadn't seen Jiraiya in nearly 12 years, and no matter how much he missed him, it was a wound that never seemed to close completely. This wasn't his Jiraiya. He hadn't shared popsicles with him, or trained with him, or been forced to edit his horrible porn. He didn't have any relationship with him, and Kira didn't know if he'd be able to look at the man without breaking down and telling him everything. So that's what he decided to do. While he visited Gaara, he dropped more hints, knowing that one of the Toad Sage's most trusted informants was there. The anniversary of Uzushio's destruction was coming, and it served as the perfect place to meet his godfather. He wondered if, perhaps, Jiraiya would be able to help him figure out what to do about Obito. If he'd be willing. He wondered if he could have any kind of relationship with the man he'd considered a father/grandfather figure in the few years he'd known him. At the very least, it was a chance to get into the village without getting in trouble, hopefully. Kira was gathering nature chakra on the remains of a fountain in what had once been the town square when he felt his father figure's chakra. He didn't draw attention to himself. Honestly, it would probably be a more embarrassing introduction than the first one they had when he'd been 12 if he had. He didn't move, no matter how much he wanted to jump up and hug the man he'd missed so much. He refrained. He had better self-control than now. No matter how much he'd rather do anything other than sit there when someone he hadn't seen in nearly 12 years was so close. It took him 2 hours to find Kiru, and in that time he'd taken in and released enough sage chakra to tip him off, but somehow didn't. The redhead wondered if it was because Jiraiya had never managed to perfect sage mode. He wondered if he'd be proud that he had. Kiru kept his eyes closed but could feel the white-haired man's stare burning through him. He wasn't worried about being vulnerable with the man. He was in no danger, and even if he was, Kiru had long since surpassed Jiraiya. It felt like hours, but when a considerable amount of time had passed, Kiru broke it. You know, he could feel Jiraiya tense, and it almost made him laugh. It's rude to stare. When his sage mode finally balanced, his eyelids turned orange, and he opened his eyes to reveal his toad-like pupils. It was, at this point, the only way Jiraiya would even remotely believe him, and even then it was a stretch. The staring continued, and Kira stood, releasing the nature energy he built up for what was probably the 10th time that hour, and sighed deeply. I'm guessing you want an explanation then. It wasn't a question, it was a fact, and Jiraiya was clearly choking on it. The Toad Sannin nodded shakily, and the Uzumaki could feel the anger and shock and confusion that battled within the older man, and he grinned at him. Honestly, it was refreshing to be the one with the knowledge, and the great Gamma Sannin in the position where he wants to know everything. He walked over to one of the few remaining entrances to the Uzumaki tunnels, oddly enough, within one of the few buildings still standing in the town square. When he couldn't sense Jiraiya behind him, he turned. Come on, he was suspicious, obviously, but Kira didn't think he could ever seriously hurt Jiraiya if he wanted to. Kurama definitely would have and did before they became friends, but that wasn't him. He made sure the older man saw him place his blood over the seal, made sure he saw that it was the same seal it had always been, and made sure he saw it release. It was important to prove his identity. He guided him deep into the tunnels, but didn't seal the door behind him in an attempt to garner a small amount of trust. When they finally reached the room he'd been looking for, the silence between the two men was sufficiently awkward. He sat down at the table and looked Jiraiya in the eyes. The things I'm about to tell you are extremely important, and I implore you to at least listen before you make any conclusions or decisions. Jiraiya's eyes narrowed. All right. It was the first thing the man had said to him since he found him, and he was wrong because this whole thing was already so much worse than their original introduction. The current leader of what's left of the Akatsuki, which was pretty much nothing at this point. Itachi was the only member other than Obito, and he had no doubt that would change soon too. Is attempting to gather the tailed beasts from their hosts in order to resurrect the Kyuubi and Madara. He has been acting in Madara's stead for the last 12 years or so after being manipulated. It was important to say that most of Obito's actions weren't entirely his own. Seeing Rin die, and taking the circumstances out of context, had been what truly allowed Madara to control him. What could happen if he continued? Obito never wanted that, and he hoped he could still get through to him. If he succeeds, it will propel the elemental nations into a war that will end in the destruction of everything. There will be no survivors. Jiraiya scoffed, and Kira was tempted to scold him because he told him to listen first. How do you figure that? Fair point, the redhead supposed. It was a considerable stretch. But he hadn't gotten there yet. If the Kyuubi is revived, the rabbit goddess Kaguya will almost definitely be revived as well. If she is, then the world is doomed. Her wrath will drive her to the planet's complete destruction. While it was true that Setsu was sealed, he had no way of knowing how long it would last, and they currently had no way to kill him. White Setsu had been destroyed by Sasuke's Susanoo, but they never figured out how to kill Black Setsu. Not for the first time, he wondered if destroying the box would destroy them with it or simply release them. And what's your proof? His skepticism was nearly tangible, and it would only get worse from here. Kira sighed and looked away as his brain provided unhelpful flashbacks. Because I lived it. Because that's why I'm here. He saw Jiraiya's laughter coming, and while it was nice to hear the man's laugh again, it also hurt because of how much pain the war had caused. He didn't blame him, none of it made any sense, but the idea of anyone belittling the suffering that war had caused still hurt because he'd lived it. He watched everyone die. Instead of giving anything away, Kira pulled out a seal similar to the one he'd used with Nagato and Konan. It would show more, the equivalent of a large-scale genjutsu slash. Do you know what this is? The seal master studied it carefully, observing every matrix it was made of. A genjutsu seal? The redhead nodded. With this I will be able to show you my memories. He placed his finger on the allotted point, and gestured for Jiraiya to do the same. It's a double-edged sword. I'll be just as involved as you if you're worried about an attack. Finally the man placed his finger on the seal and they both eased chakra into it, getting sucked into Kira's memories. They couldn't communicate, not if he wanted to only show Jiraiya the memories that mattered and not everything, but he'd likely be able to feel everything Kira did as he relived everything. The good and the bad. The happy and the depressing. All of it. He started small. Back when he was 12 and the man knocked his tutor out cold their first meeting. He smiled fondly at the memory of his innocence. Honestly, what did Jiraiya think using euphemisms with someone as dense as he'd been was going to achieve, and his Oiroku no Jutsu? He showed their training with the summoning technique and his ride with Gamabunta. He showed his younger self defeat Niji and defy his fate, and how he'd defeated Gaara who'd been consumed by Shikaku. How he met Gamakichi and how the Orange Toad convinced the boss to help him. The Sandame's funeral and how they'd retrieved Sundade. He remembered learning the Rasengan for the first time and how Bachan had given him Hashirama's necklace. He remembered how he'd destroyed it. He showed his fight with Sasuke in the Valley of the End, how he'd used Kurama's chakra and how Sasuke put a Chidori through his chest. It started getting harder after that, showing him every important moment of their near 3-year training trip and Tsunade telling him of Jiraiya's death. He showed the man how he'd lashed out, and how Iruka-sensei had gotten him back on his feet. How he'd solved the code he'd left on Fukasaku's back by the man's writing quirks, and how he'd become a sage. He showed how pain had flattened the village, and how he stopped him. He showed how he almost released Kurama, and how he met his father. He remembered Nagato and Konan, and how Nagato had given the last of his life to bring back those he'd killed in the attack. He showed the memorial he'd made with the flowered Konan had given him. He showed his training with Killer Bee and how he'd finally gotten a handle on Kurama's chakra and got to meet his mother. How Kurama's chakra allowed him to sense White Setsu's army hiding as members of the Alliance. Then he showed the war, how finally, he and Kurama became partners. How, together, they tried to save the tailed beasts from Tobi and how they gave him their chakra. He showed the casualties they faced just fighting Tobi. How Niji and so many others died because they were relying on him. He showed how much they struggled just to reveal Tobi's identity, and how much it had hurt everyone to find out that it was Obito. The revival of the dead Hokage and how he was able to fight side by side with his father. Madara's revival. Kurama's extraction and the sealing of his yin half, his whisker marks disappearing and his hair turning red, skin turning pale. The Kyuubi's revival. The Kyuubi's defeat and Kaguya's revival. Every single death he'd witnessed following her revival and the sealing of the other tailed beasts until he was the sole Jinchuriki and less than 20 shinobi remained. Sasuke was blind and he and everyone else was weak with just barely enough chakra to make the jump. He showed Jiraiya the creation of the seal that brought him to this timeline. He showed their final goodbyes and the promises he made. He showed every painstaking step he'd taken that led them here, and by the end he was trembling. He released the seal as his long-repressed trauma was dragged to the surface for the first time in almost 2 years. His eyes were cold and emotionless, but tears were still flowing down his pale cheeks just as fiercely as they had the first time he'd cried after the jump. He didn't scream, no matter how much he wanted to. He barely even whimpered. Kiri just looked into the damp eyes of the only man he'd had time to mourn and waited. Who are you? Jiraiya's eyes were narrow but not like he was suspicious. He looked more like we was trying to see, but his vision was blurred. Kira choked a half-sob/half laugh at the sheer ridiculousness of it all as he wiped his tears. Perhaps sharing all of his trauma had been a bad choice since he'd wanted to avoid causing his godfather pain, but what's done was done. On the night of October 10th, when a masked man dragged the Kyuubi from Uzumaki Kushina's seal and used him to attack the village. In order to save everyone, the Yondaime Hokage sealed the bijou into a newborn baby. His newborn baby. My name is Uzumaki Naruto. I am the son of Konoha's Yellow Flash, Namikaze's Minato, and red-hot-blooded habanero, Uzumaki Kushina and Jinchuriki of the Kyuubi no Kitsune. Suspicions confirmed, Jiraiya damp dark-eyed widened, almost comically so. The redhead gave him a lopsided smile. Here though, you can call me Uzumaki Kiru. It was dramatic and ridiculous, and Kiru reveled in it because it had been so long since he could be so carefree. You're really Naruto? He was still processing, and Kiru hoped he wouldn't need to suppress anything because Jiraiya's knowledge of the future was helpful. There is already a Naruto here, and I won't take his name. I'm fairly certain that the future I'm saving isn't my own. My friends are dead, but that doesn't mean I'm going to let this version become me. Kiru realized he was rambling and almost felt nostalgic. I know you're not him, not the Jiraiya I lost, that none of the people here are those I lost and likely never will be, but they deserve a life. Even if I can't be a part of it. That's why we're no longer the same. You're aware I was sent here to explore the possibility of inviting you into the village? Jiraiya was still distant, but he seemed less than he'd been before. Considering killing me could bring on an entirely different kind of war on Konoha, I figured it was the most likely option. He stared at the wall, dimly lit by the candles that never faded. After all that you've learned today, will you? Orochimaru and Obito are all I have left to deal with. Everyone else is either dead or no longer a threat, possibly Kabuto too. He wasn't expecting the answer to be yes. He figured the man would want the amalgamation of bad luck that Naruto had become when he turned into Kiru and focus more on his godson instead. I was sent to confirm your identity as an Uzumaki and determine whether or not you pose a threat to the village. If you met both of those requirements, I was to extend the invitation. I think you've proven you are who you say. Worst comes to worst, we check your fingerprints, right? His godfather gave a weak chuckle and Kiru managed a smile. Actually, I have another question for you. Kiru tilted his head and his red hair fell over one of his eyes. What? In the memories you showed me, you signed the Toad contract. Do you still have it? The redhead shrugged. I never tried. The toads were important to me, and if I had and they were gone, I don't know what would have happened. Why? Have the toads been acting strange around you? If the toads here had somehow merged with the ones from his original time, they would no doubt be shocked, not to mention ecstatic to see him again. Tsunade and Naruto weren't the only ones affected by the loss, after all. About 2 years ago I tried to summon a messenger toad and got about 10 others with him, including Shima-sama and Fukasaku-sama. If that was true, then maybe. Have you looked at the contract since then? Kiru was frantic with hope and excitement. Jiraiya shook his head and Kiru desperately asked him to get it. They left the tunnels and the older sage summoned Gamma, who produced the scroll from his mouth. They unrolled it carefully and looked at the name printed after Namikaze Minato's. There in the messy writing Kira had one possessed as a kid was a name, but it wasn't Uzumaki Naruto. No. Where Uzumaki Naruto's name had once been, Uzumaki Kira had taken its place. Kira agreed to go to Konoha. He wasn't sure if he'd be staying, but he'd, at the very least, hear the Hokage out. He and Jiraiya had decided that telling the Sandaime everything could wait, if they told him at all. Anyone else finding out was a risk. Showing Jiraiya had been a risk. Tobi would be livid at this point, and with his Sharingan he was dangerous. For all Kira's power, the man was still skilled in a confrontation before a proper plan was formed could be deadly, and not for Tobi. To Hiruzen he'd simply be Uzumaki Kiru, survivor of Yuzushiogeku's destruction and S-rank bounty hunter, and distant cousin of Uzumaki Mito, Uzumaki Kushina and Uzumaki Naruto. He would never be the surrogate grandson he had been in his time. Even if he could, he would never take that away from the Naruto of this time. For Kiru, he'd been dead for 14 years, so being away now shouldn't be too much more difficult. The same went for Konohamaru and the others. They would never be his. He could develop new bonds with some of them, maybe even all of them, but it would never be the same. In some ways he was glad, because that meant that they could never be replaced, but in other ways it hurt more than anything because he would never see them again. Not for the first time, since arriving in the past, Kira wondered where he would go when he died. If he would be with those who died for him, who died because of him, or those he met here. Kurama rumbled inside him as the dark thoughts began to swallow him. The fox wasn't awake yet, not entirely, but he could tell that his inner turmoil wasn't good or healthy. The redhead hoped his partner would wake up soon. He hadn't gone this long without speaking to the fox since he was 15, and before that he hadn't even known he was there. He hated it. Shikaku and the others were amazing, but Kurama had been with him since birth, even if he hadn't known it, and he needed him. If only for the sake of his sanity, because despite his hateful exterior he was much like Kiru. The fox cared deeply and protected fiercely, and was much better at hiding it than Kiru ever could be. Jiraiya gave him a funny look and Kiru avoided his eyes. There was no doubt the man had picked up on the despair leaking from him, or the power that had ceased the onslaught of emotions that had started to consume him. The Toad Sannin was well aware of who he was, who he used to be, and what he contained. Despite seeing with his own eyes that the Kyuubi wasn't an evil, uncontrolled beast, it was still hard for the Toad Sannin to believe. Because even though he didn't see Kiru or Naruto as the bijou itself, he still only thought of the beast that destroyed Konoha and killed his student and his wife. It was understandable. Kurama hadn't saved so many people here, hadn't helped defeat one of the most powerful enemies they'd ever faced. The redhead gave the older man a hint of a smile. It's nothing. Jiraiya didn't believe him. The Sannin decided to make the trip back as long as humanly possible, and Kiru was going to go insane. They'd stayed at 3 inns so far, on a trip that shouldn't have taken more than 3 days, 1 or 2 if they went with any sense of urgency, and they were only halfway to Konoha. He loved being able to spend time with Jiraiya, he did. Being able to talk about everything that happened in the past, and while it wasn't the same, it was nice. Probably the best thing that had happened to him since losing everything. However, this was getting ridiculous. He expected the distrust. Even knowing he was Naruto, that didn't mean he couldn't be a threat, and taking down 5S rank shinobi and gaining alliances with every major nation, and some small ones, other than Konoha, wasn't helping his case. He was still a stranger, and his Konoha was still gone. So when they were sitting in their room in the inn, he made the decision to open up about something that hurt marginally less than what he'd shown him days before. Talking about those he'd lost would always be hard, even talking about the good times. But he'd been told talking helped, and maybe it would lessen the tension. A bottle of sake sitting between them, and the atmosphere tense and awkward. Alcohol had been a luxury they hadn't had access to while fighting, and the few times he'd had it since his jump brought him to the conclusion that he couldn't get drunk. Kurama and the other bijou's chakra metabolized it too quickly, and when the lecher found out, the already strained atmosphere became even more uncomfortable. Kiru unsealed his Konoha forehead protector plate, running his thumb over the scratches that covered it. Some there from before he'd even received it, others gained long after. Before I officially became a genin, I failed the exam 3 times. He saw Jiraiya's eyes widen in his peripheral vision, but he didn't look him in the eye. He knew how it sounded. When people heard of his strength, they assumed he must have been a prodigy. At one time it would have been flattering, but now it seemed to undermine the hard work it had taken to get to his current level. I didn't pay attention in class. I acted out, and for a long time my transformations weren't strong enough to hide the whisker marks on my cheeks. I couldn't do a bunshin. I had no friends. I was nothing. Weak, naive, gullible. He paused as the memories of that night, nearly 14 years ago now. When I was 12, I was the only one to fail. I had to make 3 clones and I couldn't. Irika-sensei failed me for the 3rd time, and his childhood friend tried to get him to be lenient. I watched everyone in my class be congratulated by their parents, who spoke about me behind my back. Irika-sensei's childhood friend carried me away to speak to me privately. I was so grateful that someone wasn't looking at me with those damn eyes that I was willing to listen to everything he said. No questions, no thinking about how it could be wrong. I thought I could trust him, since he was a teacher. He chuckled weakly, that kind of innocence. It was something he wished he'd cherished, because becoming him wasn't fun. He convinced me that if I stole the scroll of sealing and learned a technique from it, I'd pass. He worded it differently, obviously, but that was what he wanted. His goal was to take the scroll for himself, or Orochimaru, and leave while letting the blame fall on me. Irika-sensei found me. I told him what Mizuki had told me, and he saved me. Twice. From attacks that would have been near fatal, even with Kurama. I learned about my status as Jinchuriki that night, and I learned Kage Bunshin from the scroll. I created probably close to 1,000 shadow clones and pummeled the bastard because he hurt Irika-sensei, and he was arrested. Irika-sensei gave me his forehead protector after, and officially made me a ninja. It was one of his few possessions, and it meant more to him than nearly anything else. It made him wish he hadn't destroyed Hashirama's necklace. Jiraiya laughed weakly. You really are something, Gaki. It was the first time anyone other than Hokage Jiji Sandaime-sama and the Ikarakas had ever given me anything, and the first time anyone had ever protected me. The first time someone was willing to die for me. He didn't know if he'd hated it or loved it at the time. Now he knew it was both. He loved that they thought he was worth that much, worth their life, but he hated it because he knew he wasn't worth their lives. Not really. Things were softer after that. Jiraiya told him stories from his genin days and Kira told him about his own, and the slow trip to Konoha seemed more bearable. The Sannin had him look over drafts of his latest book, Ika Ika Innocence. Kira never read it, but he helped edit the sequel, and this one wasn't much better. His ta katakana was just as hard to read as ever. It was nostalgic, and the air of normalcy that settled over them made the ache in his chest dull just a little. By the time they reached the gates to Konoha, they were on better terms. Jiraiya was no longer wary of his intentions, and it was strangely reminiscent of their relationship before retrieving Tsunade in his time. At the very least, Jiraiya was willing to try even if becoming too close would raise suspicion. They sparred and joked, and everything was okay. Kira could live with okay. When his deep blue eyes fell on the gate, it had been like a punch to the gut. Kira's breath left his lungs and he took a moment to stare. He'd been in Konoha briefly nearly 2 years before, but he had been much more tense and less willing to feel, and now that he did, it hit hard. The redhead steeled himself and followed Jiraiya silently. Kotetsu and Izumo, both alive and together, as it was supposed to be, were on gate duty, and never in his life had he ever wanted to cry over something so simple. Kotetsu was sleeping and Izumo was drifting off, and it was absolutely beautiful. The redhead planned to savor every second of it as he pushed the flashes of burning buildings and smoldering trees from his mind. Jiraiya-sama. Izumo quickly became alert at the sight of the white-haired Sannin, smacking his companion awake and knocking the shorter man off his seat in the process. Both Chunin saluted the man before finally taking notice of the short redhead beside him. His height was no longer a sore subject, seeing as it was the result of his lifelong poor diet. He really could only be mad at himself, but the fact that it took that long to see his blood-red hair was sad. Especially since either of the two were much taller than him despite his being older than the pair, though compared to Jiraiya he still looked like a kid, and he hadn't grown since he was 17. Kotetsu gaped at him. Is that? He let the question hang, but it was clear what he wanted to say. The bloody maelstrom. Being in the bingo book was less fun than Kiru had imagined as a kid. He smiled at them and bowed politely. I'm Kiru, nice to meet you. He's shorter than IEXP. Izumo elbowed his partner, effectively ending his statement before he could offend the bounty hunter. The redhead stifled a laugh. Neither shinobi commented on the lack of a last name, but he and Jiraiya had counted on it. Plenty of shinobi foregoed last names. I'm Kamizuki Izumo, and this is my partner Hagane Kotetsu. Welcome to Konoha. Thank you. The pair hid their slight fear of him well. It was to be expected with the rumors spreading like fire, but Kiru couldn't help but feel like he had as a kid. He supposed a little bit of fear was better than hatred, at any rate not that either of them had ever looked at him like that anyway. Jiraiya-sama, Sandaime-sama asked that you both meet in his office immediately upon your arrival. Thank you, Kotetsu. Jiraiya nodded as he finished filling out the paperwork necessary for Kira's entry to Konoha before turning to the redhead himself. Let's go, kid. His godfather grabbed the collar of his teal shirt and pulled him away while both Chunin stared wide-eyed at the sight. Kira supposed it must be strange seeing an S-rank shinobi with a flea-on-sight order being pulled about like a child, but he couldn't deny the humor in it. He sent them a bright grin as Jiraiya pulled him away from the booth and waved. See you later. He removed Jiraiya's hand and walked forward on his own after receiving 2 shocked waves in return. Walking the streets of Konoha was emotional, and he could tell Jiraiya was trying to make it as fast as possible. Kira didn't think he'd ever be over the fact that Konoha was here and alive. He'd probably keep repeating it until he died. Losing it twice had been hard, and he didn't plan on letting it happen again. He could feel eyes on him the entire walk. The stares he got as he walked with the Sannin to Hokage Tower weren't new per se. As a kid he was watched everywhere he went by civilians and shinobi alike. Normally with hate in their eyes that barely covered the sadness and disgust they'd felt, but after defeating pain it had changed to admiration. Being stared at like he was someone attractive was definitely new, though. He'd been looked at that way by very few people, and the few who had only thought so after knowing him, or being saved by him. Or they were Sasuke. It always was hard to tell with him. Not all the eyes he felt were civilians, though. He hadn't even discussed anything with the Sandaime yet, and the Umbu were already watching him like hawks. He only recognized Yugao's chakra, but he knew there were at least 4 others tailing them. He'd have to be especially careful about things he said, even when he was alone with Jiraiya, until they were no longer expecting him to kill someone. Kira's old spark of mischief from childhood ignited, and he couldn't help but want to mess with his viewers a little bit. It would have to wait until after his meeting, though. The Hokage's secretary gave them the go-ahead and they began the trek to the highest floor of the tower. The stairs to Sarutobi Hiruzen's office seemed never-ending and Kira could feel his heart pounding in his chest. After so many years of mourning the man he thought so highly of as a child was here and alive. 14 years of missing him, of wishing he'd been stronger or that Orochimaru had been dealt with sooner. It felt good to have the opportunity he missed when he'd been 12. Jiraiya slid the door open and allowed Kira to enter first. He felt awkward, but he held himself with the same false confidence he'd used before, making anything of himself toned down a bit for realism's sake, but fake nonetheless. The sight of the old man, exactly how he remembered him, hit Kira like one of Tsunade's punches. The office was the same as it had been before Tsunade had taken over, and it was intense. The redhead pushed the grief down and bowed deeply to the Sandaime. Hokage-sama. It was odd, being so respectful to someone he considered family, but he could hardly act familiar with the man now. My name is Uzumaki Kiryu. Thank you for your invitation. It is an honor. He hoped he didn't sound as awkward as he felt, but he probably did. He'd never been good with being professional. Dramatic? Yes. Casual? Most definitely. But he'd never really had a reason to behave professionally beyond the seriousness he felt on missions. He'd had too personal of a relationship with both Hokages of his time to treat either of them like strangers. His interactions with the other Kage, in either timeline, had been in his favor, and now that the cards were held by the god of shinobi, he wasn't quite sure what to say. Welcome, my boy. It's nice to finally meet the man considered a hero to so many countries and villages. Why have you not come to Konoha before now? His voice was gentle, and it eased some of the tension building within the redhead. His question seemed purely curious, but Kira had no doubt of the true motive behind it. He kept his eyes downcast. Not in any kind of respectful gesture, but purely to keep the older man from seeing how close to tears the story, vague as it might be, would no doubt bring him. I was a genin when my village fell and the few who survived scattered, all true, both for Yuzashio and the Konoha of his time. We were being hunted, and young and naive as I was, even I knew that I would only bring trouble. For Kushina and for Konoha. The mention of his mother's name had the desired effect. The Hokage was deeply interested in his story. I only met her a handful of times, but she was family, and being as weak as I was, I knew it would only draw more attention to her. Her duty here was important, and it was recognized among the entire clan, and putting her in any kind of danger was something none of us were willing to do. After she died, I was on my own for a long time. The survivors I was with died, and I had to become strong to survive. He embellished by adding the bit about Kushina, but everything he was saying was true. By the time I was considering settling down in any village, I ran into the zombie combo of the Akatsuki. When I learned their goal, I couldn't let them do anything with the Jinchuriki. For Yuzashio it was an honor, the first being Uzumaki Mido, princess of the Hidden Whirlpool and wife of Senju Hashirama, the Shodaime. To be a Jinchuriki meant being a hero. By preventing the Akatsuki from killing 9 people who were sacrificed in such a way, I brought their rage down on myself. I wanted to ensure the threat was eliminated completely before even attempting to lay down roots. He still wasn't sure how he'd be doing that, since he didn't want to kill Obito. As much wrong as the man did, his help was invaluable before his own passing. Feeling Kakashi's familiar chakra nearby only made him want to save him more, to give the silver-haired Jounin the friend he'd spent 12 years mourning his friend back. But the rest of him wondered if it were even possible. The last time it had been war, and it was really only finding out the truth behind a number of misunderstandings that led to his switching sides. Would showing him the future he would create be enough? Was there a way to show him the truth of that night sooner? Kira didn't know. He hoped the answer would come before someone was killed. The old man calculated every word he'd said, and it was all plausible, Kira knew. Drawing any kind of attention to Kushina, especially while she'd been pregnant, would have been detrimental. While not every citizen of Yuzashio felt that being the Jinchuriki was an honor, the one chosen was given more respect than almost anyone else for their sacrifice. The Hokage's eyes were sympathetic. You're worried you'll bring his rage directly to us. I never wanted to be the reason anyone was hurt. I've failed my friends, my comrades before. I've lost everything I've ever had and watched it burn. I won't allow the same to happen to another village, especially not one that was so loved by a member of my family. Kira hadn't meant to let out the raw passion he felt as harshly as he had, but he could tell the Hokage believed him. You carry a lot of guilt, but you still have the strength to push on. The will of fire burns brightly in you, Uzumaki Kiryu. It was the highest praise he'd ever received, and it meant more to him than someone simply telling him his strength rivaled, or even surpassed that of a Kage. Too many people have given their lives to save mine, for me to throw it away. They saw something in me, something that they valued over their own lives. Even if I don't see it, I can't let their sacrifice be in vain. The redhead was finally meeting the Sarutobi's dark eyes, and he could almost feel the fire burning in his own. It was probably the most truthful thing he told the older man. So many people had died so he could live, and to allow the grief he felt swallow him was to throw away their sacrifice. They simply meant too much to him to do that. If I ever came to Konoha before, it would have been for my family. My family is long dead now, and other members of my clan are widespread and nearly impossible to find for good reason. After losing them, it seemed like a betrayal. Like I would be trading one village for another, old friends for new ones. His voice was low, and toward the end he began fighting back tears. He'd wanted to maintain his distance for that very reason, and now that he was here, Kira wasn't sure he ever wanted to leave. This village meant the world to Kushina, and it was the only one I had no attachment to. It was a long time coming, really. It really was. How would your allies in the other villages feel if you were to join Konoha? It was important for Konoha that their relationships with the other hidden villages improve. With Suna barely in the fringes and nearly every other village hating them, it was difficult, to say the least. If you're asking if any would turn their back on me for choosing Konoha, the answer is no. At least, I don't believe so. Though there's always a chance, I suppose? If you're asking if I could get any of them to agree to a solid alliance, it's possible. Honestly, he really didn't know. A and Inoki were two of the most stubborn men he'd ever met, and they both disliked Konoha for their own reasons. The alliance they had during the war was born out of necessity, though it likely would have continued long after, and since giving up on being Hokage, his dream had been to create peace throughout the elemental nations. Kira wondered sometimes if it was truly possible with things as they were. I see, Hiruzen hummed, contemplating something. And do you plan on staying in Konoha? If you will have me, it had never been in the original plan. He was always going to take care of everything from the shadows, but now that he knows he can, now that he's there was no way he could leave. I would love to join Konoha. Hiruzen smiled at him like he knew Kira would from the beginning. What do you think, Jiraiya? Kira had nearly forgotten the man was still there. He'd been so quiet. The kid has some serious power backing him, and the white-haired man smirked knowingly. I have a feeling he'll fit in perfectly. The look the Hokage gave his ex-student sent a clear message. They would be talking privately after this meeting was over. Likely about what he learned about him in the time they spent traveling back. He looked away from his youngest student and back at Kiru. In that case, I welcome you to Konoha, Jounin Uzumaki Kiru. He knew it wouldn't be that simple, that there would be tests to his loyalty, but he'd do what he needed to. Jounin. He was a Jounin. Of course, he was aware of his strength. Really, she should have been a Jounin after Pain's attack on Konoha, or at the very least a Chunin. It had never really mattered that much before because, while it hurt to watch his friends leave him behind, it was only a title. His strength, particularly after his almost 3 years away from the village, spoke for itself. But there was something about this, about the Sandaime being the one to give him such a rank, that filled him with pride he hadn't felt since losing the parental figures in his life. Like proving his strength in this way, even though he didn't know Kira was Naruto, proved that he wasn't what everyone thought. An Anbu came in with the standard Jounin uniform and a Konoha Hitaiite. He absent-mindedly rubbed the seal near the bend of his arm, where Irika's plate was stored. He wondered how long it would take to scratch the shiny, new one enough that swapping them would go unnoticed. He took it like it was something precious, running his thumb across the smooth metal of the forehead protector before once again meeting Hiruzen's eyes. His own deep blue orbs were glassy with tears that he was barely holding back before he hid them by bowing deeply in thanks. Thank you, Sandaime-sama. It's no problem, my boy. His smile was soft, and his voice had finally lost its edge. Now, Jiraiya told me you were a master in Fuinjutsu. Can you show me? Kira didn't know if it was a test or some kind of personal assessment, but he did as asked. The redhead pulled his loose sleeves up with his fishnet shirt to expose the seals carefully inked onto his skin. Most of them are storage seals. I don't like being caught off guard, and if I ever am, I don't want to be without weapons. The easiest way to keep my weapons out of my enemy's reach is to seal it so with a few modifications and tests it was ready to go on skin. I have a bunch of them, each differing in capacity and contents. This one, he pointed to the seal directly over his left wrist, concentrating chakra into it, and pulling its contents out, is where I store my sword. Even the sword had seals, and Jiraiya wanted to look, though he kept from asking. He'd seen how he'd acquired it, and didn't want to overwhelm him further. He hadn't expected it, but he ended up getting swept into another hour about his skills in sealing. He was told that he'd be staying at Jiraiya's place for a month until they could clear out a place for him. Really, they just wanted him to be under surveillance until they were sure he could be trusted. Before the Hokage could formally dismiss him, the door opened and a tall silver-haired man walked in. Seeing Kakashi standing there, late as always, it took all of his self-control to steal his reaction. Yo, sorry I'm late. I lost track of time reading. Kakashi, the Hokage, cut him off. Since you're here, why don't you show Kiro-san around Konoha? It was an order the copy nin couldn't refuse, and he laughed sheepishly. I'm Hatake Kakashi. He held his gloved hand to Kiro to shake. Uzumaki Kiru. Pleasure to meet the copy nin in person. He grinned brightly at the man, shaking the offered hand firmly. The silence between them was awkward at first as Kakashi followed Kiru's directionless wandering. Kakashi trusted him even less than the Hokage did, and the redhead didn't know how to fix it. The older man was one of the best he knew at hiding his emotions, and with over a month until he was forced to take on a genin team, it was obvious why guard duty on an S-rank shinobi would be bothersome. If you have questions, Hatake-san, now would be the time to ask. He turned another corner watching the civilians go about their daily tasks. He couldn't help the small smile he wore the longer he observed. Just Kakashi is fine. Referring to him by his last name was a reminder of his father, Kira knew, but it was a start. Why not come to Konoha sooner? He didn't look up from his book, but Kira hardly noticed. If you watched your village fall and most of its inhabitants die, would you be able to simply join a new village? His smile turned wry. It would have been the most severe betrayal. At least to me. The loss of everyone you cared about was something Kakashi was able to sympathize with, though to a much lesser degree. He smiled at the redhead with his visible eye. I guess that's fair. His wandering led the pair to the memorial stone, and finding his parents' name was quick. He'd done it a number of times before, both before and after finding out about his parents. Kushina was the only other Uzumaki he'd ever heard of at the time, and he remembered dreaming that this name belonged to a member of his family. It was only during the moments he'd felt the most lonely, but finding out it was his mother had made him happier than he could ever hope to describe, because his mother hadn't given him up, she'd wanted him. It hadn't been something he was used to, even when he was hailed as a hero to the village. He discreetly ran his thumb over his father's name, unable to openly mourn him, before settling on Uzumaki Kushina. This is the memorial stone. It was like that first test after he'd first become a genin. The names of all the shinobi killed in battle are on this stone. Did you know her? His voice was gentle, and he tried not to let on that he already knew the answer. I did. Was she happy? From everything he'd heard from his father during the war and the few conversations he'd had with the Kakashi of his time, she had been, but it felt right to ask directly. She missed her home, that much was obvious, but I think she was. She was loved by many, especially her husband, and she was an exceptionally strong shinobi. They called her the red-hot-blooded habanero. Kiru couldn't help but chuckle. He and his mother were very similar in that regard. She had the Uzumaki temper that bad, huh? If he hadn't changed as much as he had, he likely would have said something about his own temper, but he'd long since mellowed out. Social as he still tried to be, silence was just easier sometimes, and the enthusiasm he'd had as a kid was long faded. An old scar, at that point. She was a time bomb. One wrong word and she would explode, and wasn't that the truth? You don't seem nearly that short-tempered. Kira stood and resumed his wandering. It's bluster, mostly. A natural defense in the face of humiliation. I used to have it worse than most, but I don't know. I guess I grew out of it after being alone for as long as I was. It was a lie. The war had simply not allowed it, and he became more in control of his emotions because of it. He glanced at Kakashi. Are you actually reading that, or are you just staring at the pages? If there's one thing I'm completely sure about, it's that kid would never harm Konoha. Jiraiya looked his ex-teacher dead in the eyes as he said it. He couldn't betray the confidence his alternate godson had placed in him, but he would, at least, assure him of that. So you think the two should be introduced sooner? If he were Hokage, he'd have already had them introduced, but he also had knowledge about the situation no one else was privy to. The genin exams are coming up in a little over a month, right? I think around then would be ideal, as long as nothing goes too wrong beforehand. Kiru had been very clear on how he felt about interfering in his counterpart's genin exam. Any active attempts to keep them apart would be obvious to both, so it may be better if they meet naturally on their own and only interfere if they manage not to. Finding out about family will probably only solidify his loyalty. Hiruzen hummed. You trust him then? It was a statement. Not a question. He hasn't yet given me a reason not to. Then I'll take it into consideration. For now we'll give him a week or two to settle in before sending him off on missions. Your assessment of his skills? He's highly skilled in nearly all areas, the only exception being genjutsu. There are few men without the Sharingan who can claim to be a master of all the elements. A spar between him and any of our elite is bound to be entertaining. It was an endearing idea, to test him with a spar against some of the finest Konoha had to offer. Kakashi hated to admit it, but he was intrigued by Konoha's newest jounin. He didn't trust him, of course, not yet, but he didn't feel like the man was likely to betray Konoha. The first thing the copy Nin had noticed was the visual similarity between Kiryu and Kushina. Their faces were very similar. Kushina had slightly smaller, darker eyes and Kiryu had sharper cheekbones and a thinner face, but there was no doubt that the two were related and fairly closely. Kushina had never talked much about her family, not with him at least, so he wasn't sure if she'd had any siblings or first cousins, but it was obvious to Kakashi that it wasn't simply clan blood making them look alike. He was scarred, not heavily but visibly, and his hair was a deeper red, a color more akin to blood than tomatoes like Kushina had often been compared to. He wondered briefly if his nickname was referring to his hair and not his brutality. Perhaps it was both. He was her height too, if Kakashi remembered correctly. Short for an adult man but not uncommon for those who hadn't had access to appropriate meals. It was something he'd often worried about with Naruto, even if he'd never acted on his desire to interfere in his grief, a mistake he deeply regretted. The second thing was the overwhelming grief in the man's dark blue eyes. It reminded him of his own in many ways but stronger, and he carried the same guilt as well. It was a rare thing, Kakashi thought, for people to understand his spiral of self-destruction that deeply. It wasn't something he wished on anyone, let alone someone related to the woman he'd seen as an older sister. He was also weird. He wasn't annoyed by Kakashi stuffing his face in his book, he barely seemed to notice it at all, or by the material itself like many others. He'd simply snorted, a sound that reminded him distinctly of Kushina and her son on the rare occasions he'd seen him, and shook his head fondly. It was as infuriating as it was fascinating, and it left the one-eyed jounin torn. He wondered if he'd met others with similar hobbies or if he was laughing at something else entirely. Uzumaki-sen, the Uzumaki cut him off before he could ask his next question. Kiryu, please. Uzumaki-san makes me feel old. Kiryu-san, then? How old are you? Kushina was only a teenager when Yuzashio fell. I turned 26 in October. I was almost 7 when Yuzashio was destroyed. Ah, you're younger than me. I should have guessed. Kakashi couldn't help the teasing. It was odd, feeling this sort of kinship with a stranger, but he felt as though he knew the redhead in a way he couldn't explain. He couldn't help but feel hopeful that this man would be loyal to Konoha. None of that changed the fact that if he met this man on the road, he would have expected him to be about 10 years younger than he was. Kiryu's faint smile faded as his head snapped to the left of where they were standing, where the training grounds were. Kakashi was too late to pick up on the blobs of green running their way. He supposed that shinobi racing toward you at top speed, especially after pursuing missing Nin for years, would make most people tense. Especially these shinobi. He kept his face in his orange book as the blurs slowed down. Guy and his clone stood side by side next to them, barely out of breath. Yash! Kakashi! My eternal rival! I challenge you to a race. From here to the top of the Hokage monument. If I lose, I'll do the silver-haired jounin tuned him out. He only looked up from his book when he felt 3 pairs of eyes watching him expectantly. He glanced at the taller man. Did you say something? Somewhere amid his complaining about Kakashi's supposed hipness, Guy took notice of Kiryu watching the pair with amusement clear in his eyes, along with something else he couldn't quite grasp. How unyouthful of me. I'm Mato Guy, Konoha's sublime green beast of prey. This is my student Rock Lee. He spoke as loudly as always as he introduced himself and his clone to the Uzumaki. The mini-guy bowed deeply. Nice to meet you. Kiryu's laugh was a bright sound, and it was obviously genuine. I'm Kiryu, it's nice to meet you too, he smiled at the pair, not looking the least bit weirded out by whatever you wanted to call that. He didn't use his last name, Kakashi noticed. He wondered if it was out of habit. He'd heard plenty of rumors following Yuzashio's destruction of the Uzumaki clan being hunted. Are you new to Konoha, Kiryu-san? Lee asked politely, and Kiryu's smile was fond as he looked down at the kid. I am. As of today, I am officially a Konoha jounin, though I'll probably continue to be monitored until the Hokage is completely positive I can be trusted. He mentioned his Umbutales so casually, and both older jounins stared at the redhead in shock. Kiryu's cheeks pinkened and he looked embarrassed. He rubbed the back of his neck. Was I not supposed to know about them? He chuckled nervously before answering the question both Kakashi and Guy had been thinking. I'm a sensor. While they're hiding their chakra well, I've always been particularly sensitive, especially after mastering senjutsu. They continued staring. Senjutsu wasn't a common practice, and mastering it was even rarer. This man didn't even seem to register what he'd just said. It was clear Lee didn't understand either. No one explained it. Kira still looked uncomfortable and changed the subject in a way that was less than subtle, though still effective. So, Madoga, you're a taijutsu expert, right? I'm pretty sure your name has come up before. The redhead was lucky Guy was so easily distracted. Exactly right. He all but shouted, and Kakashi subtly began to move the group to where Guy's volume wouldn't disturb the rest of the public since he clearly wasn't getting out of this any time soon. Are you proficient in taijutsu, Kira-san? I'm decent enough. Kakashi didn't believe decent was accurate, but he'd wait until seeing the man in action to make any judgment. I know a few styles, but hand-to-hand isn't my biggest strength. Those would be ninjutsu and fuinjutsu, I believe. He rolled up the sleeves of his kimono shirt to reveal the seals painted up his arms. There were a mix of different kinds of seals, some Kakashi recognized with his own limited knowledge of the subject and others that were completely unfamiliar. Storage seals, stasis seals, chakra storing seals, all modified and inked directly onto his pale skin like tattoos. They probably were tattooed. Guy seemed impressed, his volume lowered and his voice became slightly more serious. Fuinjutsu is a lost art these days. Few shinobi are proficient enough to create their own seals instead of just using mass-produced tags and scrolls. Kira's eyes softened. Yeah, but there's something beautiful about them, you know? After I learned the basics, I couldn't help but continue. Both of my parents and my teachers had been talented in fuinjutsu. I guess a part of me wanted to be able to make them proud. Even without knowing Kira was an Uzumaki, the implication was clear: they were dead. Ninjutsu was almost always the easiest for me, though. When I was a kid, I had a hard time paying attention in class, and ninjutsu was one of the only subjects I found interesting enough to pay attention to. I struggled with almost everything else. Honestly, it's a wonder I managed to become a shinobi at all, looking back. He looked embarrassed by the fact, but Lee was looking up at the redhead with stars in his eyes. The Uzumaki clan was notorious for their larger-than-normal chakra reserves, and mine go even further than that, so my control was atrocious, and I could only do higher-rank techniques because of the amount of chakra they used. I got better, but I was made fun of a lot for my lack of inherent talent. I can't use chakra at all and have to rely entirely on taijutsu. When I was still in the academy, I too was bullied for my lack of ability. But then Gai-sensei found me. Now I am able to make up for my inability to use chakra with my body alone. The kid got progressively louder with each sentence, but Kira didn't waver. Do you work hard, Lee-kun? The question seemed to come out of nowhere, and the young teen seemed taken aback for a moment before a fire lit in his eyes. Of course. Nothing is more youthful and powerful than hard work. The redhead's smile widened. Then you will make your sensei proud. He sounded so sure of what he was saying, and perhaps it was personal experience in the matter, but Kakashi got the distinct feeling it was more than that. Tears of gratitude welled in Lee's large eyes, and Kakashi realized it was probable that no one except Guy himself had ever had so much faith in him before. Yash! Lee! Your flames of youth burn brightly. Guy gave his student his nice guy pose. Guy-sensei! Lee! Guy-sensei! The tears and hugging, waves crashing on sand and setting sun were too much for the Sharingan user, and he desperately wished he could unsee what he was seeing. Kira didn't look nearly as bothered. That look was back, and Kakashi still didn't quite know what it was. The redhead chuckled. He's like Konoha's version of Killer Bee. Kakashi didn't know which he was referring to, though since Lee was essentially Guy's clone it didn't really matter, and he didn't know Killer Bee personally, but he'd heard stories. The Jinchuriki of the Hachibi was proud of it, and was known for his terrible rapping. He didn't quite see how they could be similar, but he supposed Kira would know better than he would. The shorter man was once again distracted by the area Guy and Lee had come from, and when Kakashi looked over to see what had captured the redhead's attention this time, he found two more teenagers. A Hyuga boy, judging by his long brown hair and telltale pale eyes, and a girl with her brown hair in two small buns. Kira made a choking sound beside him, though when he looked over his face was relaxed. That wasn't what caught Kakashi's attention, though. Because despite the relaxed look on his face, his eyes, that expressed his emotions so vividly, were now cold as steel and void of emotion. Kira felt the familiar chakra signatures before he saw them. Two familiar brunettes, one with twin buns atop her head and the other with pale eyes, cold and prideful and hurt, with long hair tied at the ends. His breath caught in his throat as the wave of emotions hit him. Niji. The last time he'd seen him was when they were 16 and 17, and he'd given his life to save Hinata and himself. He gave his life so they could win, and Kira failed him. Hinata was still killed and the world was still, most likely destroyed after his departure. Tenten was the most fresh though. She'd been one of the last and had died to get him here. He hadn't seen her death, he wasn't sure if that was good or not. He didn't know if it was painful. He just knew that her sacrifice, all of their sacrifices couldn't be in vain. Especially not when he was so close to finally ending it. He steeled himself before anyone could see anything, before the wave of emotions he felt made him seem suspicious without Erosen there to back him up. Out of the corner of his eye he saw Kakashi look at him. Something seemed to catch his interest, but Kira was too busy staring at the two genin. He hoped that when he spoke his voice wouldn't waver. He didn't think it would ever hurt less, having to act like these people were total strangers. The saddest part was that even at age 13 to 14 they were already nearly his height as an adult. He was barely more than 10 centimeters taller than them now, and when he'd been their age he was at least 10 centimeters shorter. Tenten had been his height before he jumped back in time, and before he died Lee had been quite a bit taller than himself. Niji had always been around his male teammate's height, and Kira couldn't help but wonder how tall he'd be as an adult now that he would actually become one. He was broken from his reverie by loud pants and sad attempts to catch their breath. Guy-sensei, Lee, you both just took off again. Not everyone can be like you too. Tenten whined, bright and innocent, and so unbelievably free of the weight of war. Kira never wanted any of them to lose that innocence and lightness. It was unrealistic, of course, because they were ninja, but at the very least, he hoped they would never be like him. The redhead watched them bicker for a while, unable to stop the fond smile from crossing his features. If Kakashi or anyone asked, he'd just tell them it reminded him of his days as a genin. It wasn't a lie. It was minutes, though it felt closer to an hour, before Lee's teammates noticed him, and it only reminded him further of how safe they felt in the village, how completely carefree they were at this age. He knew he would die to keep it that way. You are sorry, who are you? I don't think I've ever seen you around the village before, Tenten asked, her eyes slightly narrowed. It was almost cute that she was so suspicious of him despite the pleasant conversation he'd been having with two well-known and respected Konoha jounin. She did her best to keep her eyes off of his pink scars and inked-on seals, but it was still noticeable, and the Uzumaki could tell she wanted to ask. She held back, for now at least. He smiled at her pleasantly, not letting the pain of his losses show on his face. I don't suppose you would have, since I'm from outside the village. I won't really consider myself a full-fledged jounin until my shadows are gone, though. He couldn't help but poke fun, and he laughed at his own joke and saw Kakashi's posture stiffen slightly. I'm assuming the two of you are Lee-kun's teammates? I'm Kiru. It's nice to meet you both. The two jounin were staring at him. Should I also mention I'm a censor type before the first people I meet turn on me? Was I supposed to play unaware? His body language, Kirin knew, made him seem nervous, but one look into his deep blue eyes would reveal the mischief within them. Both jounin knew he was an Uzumaki. It really shouldn't be surprising. It was in his blood after all. The genin didn't pick up on the tense atmosphere except maybe Niji, but that was likely from experience within his family than anything else. I'm Tenten, the genin girl introduced herself before gesturing to the taller teen standing beside her. This grump is Niji. I couldn't help but notice, you have seals inked onto your skin. Kira laughed for real this time. Tenten always was bold when he knew her. This shyness, her uncertainty just proved that there was still a real chance. I do. Most of them are storage seals. My previous job involved a lot of moving around, and carrying heavy packs wasn't really an option. Not to mention it's much harder to disarm me this way. I keep my kunai, senbon, explosives, and shuriken sealed in easy-to-access places on my arms as well as provisions. In here, Kira pumped a small amount of chakra into the seal over his wrist and pulled his sword out of it. I keep my sword. It was a precious gift, so I make sure to always keep it safe. It was his final connection to the first person he'd ever truly loved in a way that extended past familial, one of his only true possessions at this point. There were so few things he had to remember, those that he'd lost, the versions of these people that they would never become. He couldn't afford to lose or break it due to carelessness. Do you like seals, Tenten-chan? He knew she did, of course. Fuinjutsu was her best skill besides her expertise over weapons. It definitely paid to have a father in the business. Kiru was almost jealous. Well, I really want to become a medic like Tsunade-sama, but the redhead knew immediately she was in the middle of her self-realization, where she realized she may not have the control necessary to be a medic, but she was skilled in another area. That's an admirable goal. Tsunade-sama is an amazing kunoichi, but he looked at her with a half-smile and warm eyes. That's not to say you can't be the Tsunade-sama of something else. Forgive me if this is too forward, but you seem much more enthusiastic about seals and weapons. Her face cheeks turned pink, but she didn't respond, and Kira didn't push. Tenten had to make her decisions on her own, but there was no reason he couldn't get her, or anyone else, thinking. Really, he was only pushing them in the right direction. Tenten was amazing at sealing and utilizing weapons. She'd helped him get started on both fronts, and he'd hate for her to pursue a skill she wasn't nearly as enthusiastic about. I'd love to spar with you sometime. Fuinjutsu users are fairly rare nowadays, it could be fun. Just a thought. Tenten's brown eyes lit up, but she didn't respond. That was fine. He knew he'd probably be hanging out with Guy fairly often, since he was really only acquainted with him and Kakashi so far, and he doubted Jiraiya would stay long, so she'd have plenty of opportunities to take him up on his offer. He turned his attention to young Niji, who was giving the Uzumaki an odd look. His inner conflict over his familial structure was more than clear. Kiru wondered how long it was until the next Chunin exams before deciding that he'd give a few small pushes and let the Hyuga and his counterpart figure out the rest. You're a Hyuga, yes? He asked as though it weren't painfully obvious by his long dark hair and pale eyes and skin. Niji narrowed his eyes. I am. His voice held pride, and in some way his eyes did too. Pride for being part of the strongest living clan in Konoha. His eyes also held the kind of disappointment that you only feel in yourself. The kind of anger and frustration only those who've been cursed can feel. He'd long since stopped thinking of Kurama as a curse, but he had when he'd first found out about him. Right now he was just hoping the damn fox would wake up. Why? The redhead blinked innocently. What do you mean? I just thought I've seen those eyes before. I've fought a few Hyuga in my time. They're long gone now, but they despised the system within the clan and wanted to change it. They're two people I've admired for a long time, even if one of them had a stick up his ass at first. Kira laughed at his own joke. He knew Niji probably assumed one of the two was his father, and it may work in his favor. His smile turned sad as he continued. It was the way he talked about fate that gave me my motto though, or one of them at least. Now Niji looked interested, and Kira couldn't help but wonder how Niji could have turned out if he'd had someone who understood. If his father had survived, if either twin had to die. What do you mean? What motto? His tone was harsh, but his eyes were desperate, and it was that desperation that made the Uzumaki a bit more open than he normally would have been at first. He sighed sadly. I live by 3 main rules. I never go back on my word, nothing is set in stone, and never let sacrifices be in vain. Everyone was listening now, and Kiru forced himself to press on. For a long time I was unsure of myself, because every time things seemed to get better they would just become 1,000 times worse. Every clan, every family, every person has a curse. For some it's their pride and their hatred, for others it's a seal or loss. I met a member of the side branch when I was 12. He paused as he considered just how long ago that was for him now, how it was more than likely his counterpart will have a similar fight. We fought each other, and in that fight he talked about how I could never understand his curse, that because of how I lived I'd never amount to anything. How because he was a Hyuga, he was destined to win. He made me want to fight to prove that things like blood or a name don't define you, don't determine who you're meant to be. I'm not my lost clan. I'm not defined by the loss of my family or my friends. I am what I decide to be, not what fate decides. Niji's sneer was expected, but Kira could see the gears turning in his head as he pondered the words. You can't defy fate. What you want doesn't matter. It was a wonder how no one saw Niji's issues before that fight in the Chunin exams. Niji was so obviously suffering, not only from the treatment from the main branch, but also because he's yet to learn the truth about his father. I don't believe that. In fact, I would go so far as to say I'm living proof it's possible. I was orphaned at a young age, was disliked by a lot of people, was terrible at academics, and to cope with the loneliness I felt I became someone you couldn't help but look at, even if it was an annoyance. I was told a lot growing up, even after the fall of my village, that got gasps from Lee and Tenten, but Kiru ignored them. That I would never be able to make a name for myself. I've lost everything, and I have a chance to make sure it doesn't happen to anyone else. My name, or title I suppose, is known across the elemental nations, and in a lot of villages I'm considered a hero. I earned the respect I'd yearned for since I was a child. If I maintained the belief that I wouldn't ever amount to anything, I wouldn't have, for the simple reason that would mean I've given up. He grinned, wide and proud, down at Niji. I don't give up. Not even after losing everything? Tenten's voice was sad, and the question itself was hesitant. Kiru's eyes were probably glassy as images of those he's lost flashed in his mind. He didn't let any tears fall. I might have if my best friend hadn't died to make sure I didn't. I won't lie, it's hard, but giving up will never help. If you can't do it, either practice more or find another way. Honestly, I think that if some of the people who used to tell me to give up saw me now, they wouldn't even believe I'm the same kid. It was a stab at the fact that he changed so much since he was a teenager, physically and skill-wise. None of you, not even Gai-san or Kakashi-san, believed me when I said I was a mess as a kid. I almost wish I had pictures. You said your title was known across the elemental nations? Niji was always straight to business, blunt, and cared a lot about power before their battle. Even having only met him a few times before that fight, it was obvious, and as dumb as he'd been as a kid, he was still observant. Kiro had been trying to avoid talking about it, since that kind of thing would make normal people weary, and that was the last thing he wanted. He glanced at his glorified babysitter for permission to tell them. Genin or not, they were children and were still innocent to many of the horrors of the shinobi world. Kiro took his silence and lack of any reaction as the all clear. Over the last year or so, I spent my spare time collecting the bounties on S-rank missing nin who were planning on kidnapping a small group of people in order to take control of the world. He didn't brag, just as when he mentioned his growing popularity across the elemental nations, he was simply stating a fact. I collected the bounties on Hashigaki Kisame, Sasori of the Red Sand, Deidara, Kakuzu, and Haiden. I also put an end to a civil war and made friends with almost every village leader. I think that's it? Oh, and I became close with 8 of the 9 people I was trying to save. Kiro wondered if the gaping looks were always going to happen. Though Niji only looked like he was frozen, he knew the boy well enough to know he was just as shocked as his teammates. Personally, he thought his achievements in his other timeline were more impressive. Uniting the elemental nations, making friends with the most feared Bijou, rivaling Kage's strength as a genin, talking several enemies out of being enemies on top of pounding their faces in, and saving Konoha multiple times just had a better ring to it than killing a few people. He would much prefer to be known for saving lives than ending them, even if they were enemies. Gaisen, it seems I've broken your genin. I apologize. He jokingly bowed and Guy laughed. It was obvious the elite jounin had been up to date with what he'd been doing, even if they weren't necessarily in on Sarutobi's plan to invite him into the village. You took down 5 S-rank missing nin and only have a handful of scars? Tenten sounded like she was torn between being terrified and being impressed. No, Kira laughed sheepishly. I don't have any scars from my encounters with the nuke nin. These are all from the war that destroyed my village. Those looks were back, and they would have made him self-conscious if he weren't used to stares by now. Perhaps growing up always being stared at and then continuing to be stared at after becoming a hero to his village had its perks. If you have friends all across the elemental nations, why didn't you join one of their villages? It was a good question, one he'd never expected from Genin, and both Kakashi and Guy seemed just as interested as the kids. A member of my family came to Konoha as a child and grew to be an amazing kunoichi here. She loved this village and died for it about 12 years ago. I'd never had any true contact with Konoha after my village fell, and I wasn't going to ask to join, but I knew from the beginning that if I ever joined another village it would be Konoha. I was tempted for a while, but it felt like I was betraying those who died fighting for our home. It was the most raw conversation he'd had with anyone other than Hiruzen and Jiraiya, but he figured it was best to be honest. He obviously couldn't say he was from the future, but none of what he said was technically a lie. They stared more, and he was about to break the spell with a joke to Kakashi and his shadows, but something else caught his attention. Jiraiya-sama, it felt horribly awkward to call the man that, but they both decided it was a good idea to be formal for the time being. Are you going to continue to stare like the peeping Tom you are, or do you care to join the conversation? He said it offhandedly, and Jiraiya jumped out of his hiding place, summoning Gamma and sitting on his back. It is I, the great Toad Sage of Mount Myaboku, Jiraiya. The genin didn't seem nearly as impressed with Jiraiya as Kira had been when he first met him, but he supposed his godfather was a goof, and they likely didn't know who he was. Tenten-chan, this is Tsunade-sama's teammate and another of the legendary Sannin. The dots seemed to connect for her, though she still didn't seem all that impressed. He supposed that was fair. Tsunade's name was much more widespread than Jiraiya's, and she'd never seen him fight. Yo, Jiraiya-sama, the 2 other jounin acknowledged him. Kakashi wasn't very talkative in general, but Kira noticed he was especially quiet around him. He wondered why. He turned his attention back to his godfather. Did gossiping about me with Hokage-sama go well? The redhead teased, and Jiraiya scowled. You love causing trouble, don't you, Gaki? I'm told it runs in the family, he deadpanned. They had to find out one way or the other. I figured that was the most natural. Figures you were watching. Besides, being a master in senjutsu is much more impressive to me than just being a good sensor type. Jiraiya was far from a master, but the compliment seemed to help calm the frustrated Sannin just a little. Besides, you should be grateful that's all I did. I could have easily identified their exact numbers, elemental affinities and genders, but I didn't. He smirked. Truth be told, he could only do that in Sage mode, but they didn't need to know that. You need to be in Sage mode for that, brat. Bastard. Buzzkill. They bickered, uncaring of their current company. including Kiru's shadows. Being around Jiraiya always seemed to revert him to his childish nature. It was nice not needing to be serious, with the exception of the first few conversations they had regarding the future, and Kiru's past, of course. He groaned. He hadn't been this inactive since his first few weeks in the past, and he certainly hadn't gone so long without so much as a spar. Kiru had way too much energy coming off of a year-long self-assigned mission to destroy the Akatsuki. Thinking about it, even if he could spar right now, he couldn't go all out. The training ground wouldn't survive it, and he definitely didn't want to deal with the aftermath. Growing up, he'd never considered the disadvantages of being a powerful shinobi. Kakashi was amazed at the change in attitude from the red-haired man. One minute he's being deep and philosophical and meaningful, and the next he's reduced to a child. It would have been amazing if it weren't so ridiculous. The man didn't even brag like a normal person. He was so modest when it was obvious to anyone who understood just how much skill it took to stand against missing Nin and come out on top. That's not even mentioning the fact that he'd single-handedly stopped a civil war that had been raging for years. Kakashi didn't get it at all. Even he liked to brag, not even just when he was a child either. Everyone bragged, but Kira didn't seem to be able to. Perhaps because, if he wasn't lying, he'd fought so hard for the strength he wields. He claimed he wasn't naturally gifted. Kakashi couldn't tell if it was just him being modest again or if it was true. Kushinae had been good in school, if not a bit loud if Minato-sensei's words were to be believed, though he was biased, and most Uzumaki seemed naturally gifted with Fuinjutsu. He wasn't sure he'd ever figure this man out. He was a tiny ball of pure energy and unadulterated strength who was the opposite of full of himself. It was pretty much unheard of. The closest he could think of was Minato-sensei. Though he'd never had endless amounts of energy, he never once heard the man brag or use his superior strength to make someone else feel inferior. Kiru kind of reminded him of his late teacher, in an odd way. They looked nothing alike. Minato-sensei had been a tan blonde where Kiru was a pale redhead like Kushinae, but sometimes when the redhead smiled kindly down at guys' brats there was this look. It was the same look the yandame used when he looked at Kakashi and his late teammates, sadder at times, but otherwise a near-perfect comparison. The Sharingan eyed Jounin wondered if he'd ever look at a bunch of brats that way. The Hokage had been on his tail about taking another team, another one that would inevitably fail and waste his time, no doubt, and he was dreading it. The Genin exams were coming up in barely a month and Kakashi already had a feeling his team would include the last Uchiha. After all, who better than to teach an Uchiha his Sharingan than a man who carried the Dijutsu himself? He didn't want to deal with a second coming of himself as a child, let alone one about 1,000 times worse. He felt bad for the kid, but that was baggage that even he didn't want to touch. He was terrible with kids, more likely to make them cry or angry than actually teach them. He didn't know how Irika dealt with them every day. Especially Naruto, who had been a menace since he could walk. He could show them how to do something, even explain it, but getting through to them? Turning them into proper shinobi? Kakashi knew he'd be a terrible teacher. Kiru, on the other hand, seemed to have a natural talent for teaching even just a simple lesson about not giving up. He seemed to understand them on a level that was almost personal and encourage their growth in the right areas, all while shutting down toxic habits like doing something because you're fated to. Even Kakashi had learned something from the redhead's words of wisdom. Friend killer Kakashi they'd called him, because the people he got close to were cursed to die. He'd been pushing people away ever since losing the most important people to him, and here was a man who'd lost everything. His friends, his clan, his village, and here he was bickering with one of the legendary Sannin, even if he was the most perverted man Kakashi had ever met, and laughing and smiling. He still hurt, but it didn't seem to rule over him like it did the silver-haired shinobi. Instead, it seemed to be what motivated him, like he genuinely wanted to keep another village from falling. It was possible that it was simply because the entire world was at stake if Jiraiya's intel and Kira's words were to be believed, but Kakashi suspected there was more to it than that. Kakashi was broken from his thoughts by the two shinobis bickering finally coming to an end. Seems it's time for me to go. Kira grinned at the genin. If any of you want to spar or have any questions, feel free to track me down. The redhead turned his head to Guy. Guy-san, that goes for you too. Kakashi couldn't understand how Kira could stand to be around Guy for this long and still want to hang around him, but apparently the redhead liked him well enough. Of course Kakashi didn't hate Guy. The man just tried his patience better than anyone else and had since childhood. He'd never forget the incident in the bathroom or the acorn thing. Ever. Kakashi-san, Jiraiya said you're not off babysitting duty yet. He did provide an escape though, so he supposed he could deal with Kira being friends with Guy. As they walked away, he couldn't help but ask the question that had been bugging him since his eternal rival. Was all that true? Kira blinked cluelessly. Was all what true? Kakashi didn't even think he was trying to avoid the question either. What you said to Guy's brats. The redhead's mouth formed an O in realization and he smiled. I don't have any reason to lie. Even if it was kind of heavy, it's not something I could lie about. The people I've lost deserve better than that, even if they're not here anymore. Despite being alone for years, being a team, protecting people, is something I've always valued, and even though they're gone, I refuse to disrespect their memory by pretending it didn't happen. Even if it is children asking. His cheeks turned pink and his voice softened. That's not to say I want to tell everyone. If someone asks, I won't lie. Kakashi certainly understood that sentiment. His best friend had once said that those who break the rules are trash, but those who abandon their friends are worse than trash. Even though they were gone, he could never abandon their memory, but he could move forward. He decided to move from such a heavy subject before the atmosphere could become too awkward. So where exactly are we going? Kakashi raised a silver eyebrow at the pair of sages, and they both sported matching grins oddly reminiscent of Obito's. Perhaps it wasn't so unbelievable that he'd been an idiot growing up. Jiraiya had been the Obito of his own team, or maybe Obito was the Jiraiya of their team, and he, along with his teammates, were Kage level in strength. First we're getting barbecue, then we're gonna spar and you're gonna judge. Jiraiya seemed a bit too gleeful about this and Kakashi had a bad feeling. There was no way a spar between one of the Sannin, and whatever you wanted to call Kuru, would end in anything other than destruction. He was doomed. Barbecue ended up being one of Jiraiya's better ideas, as it turned out. It gave Kuru a chance to properly talk to Kakashi for the first time since he'd seen the man crushed. Jiraiya told me you're taking a team this year. He said you've never passed a group of genin before. It wasn't the best way to start a conversation, but it would do. They've never passed my test. What was your test? Strength? Endurance? Arsenal? He made sure to avoid what he knew the test was and kept his voice as innocently curious as possible. Years with Jiraiya had taught him a thing or two about acting, even if he only really got good at it when he became an adult. Teamwork. They need to display teamwork to pass. And how many have failed? He never did get the answer to this when he was younger, and it was something he'd always wanted to know. The answer was immediate. 5. Kuru was tempted to ask why the Hokage continued if he never passed a single team but refrained and allowed Kakashi to ask him something instead. What about you? Have you ever been a teacher? Kuru felt the answer should have been obvious but didn't express any annoyance. Not the way you or Gai-sen are. I never had the chance. There was a group of kids a little younger than me that looked up to me. I was the first person to acknowledge their little leader, and he decided he'd be my apprentice. In the end we were more like brothers, but still I taught him my favorite techniques. He wanted to be my rival when apprentice didn't work out. His laugh was sad and it was frustrating because everything seemed to become about his losses because that was all he had anymore. He chose to fight off the pain with a smirk. Eternal rivals, huh? Kakashi choked. Kuru wasn't sure if he actually had any food in his mouth or not with the mask covering his face, or illusion of one, it didn't matter. No. Jiraiya and Kira laughed brightly at the vehement denial. Of course, he knew Kakashi considered Guy a close friend, and if he didn't now he would in the next few years, but their friendship/rivalry would never not be funny. I had a one-sided rivalry with my best friend for a while. He was full of himself, loved waving his name around as if the world owed him because of it. I don't think I'd ever seen him more angry than when he lost to me. It was only a slight exaggeration. Technically the war, Orochimaru, and the whole situation with his brother and Obito angered Sasuke more than a loss to him ever could, especially later on, but as kids it was the truth. Just for kicks, because it's something normal people wouldn't joke about, he mentioned it. He stuck an assassination technique I never learned through my chest once too. It was light-hearted, but Kakashi still paused and Kira wondered if he would put the pieces together and figure out that he was from the future. It could be a fun game since the man was one of the few others he would ever even dream of trusting that information to. And this was your best friend. Kakashi seemed slightly disgusted, understandably so. He wasn't in full control of himself. Almost everything that happened in that fight was done under the influence of a cursed seal. It took years to figure out how to remove it without the bastard resurrecting himself through it. Kakashi's eyes widened in realization. Oh. Yeah. Orochimaru wanted my best friend's body. It was weird, especially when we were kids. What he said about Orochimaru seemed to be ignored by the Sharingan user in favor of his mention of the curse seal. It also caught the attention of two other shinobi. Two familiar jounin practically jumped into the extra seats at their table. One with long blonde hair held tight in a ponytail much like his own, though considerably shorter, and the other taller than even Jiraiya. How unfair. The three who'd been at the table first wore matching startled expressions. Kira had known they were there, he'd felt the pair the moment they walked in, but two men who worked in TNI were the last people he'd expected to do that. Even for something as important as the curse seal. You can remove Orochimaru's curse seal of heaven? The scarred man sounded doubtful. Who are you? He asked for appearances, but also because when you start talking to a stranger it's only right you give them your name, even if they secretly already knew, because that first test in the Chunin exams was hard to forget. Ibiki, his eyes narrowed dangerously. You're the bounty hunter. Kira smiled sheepishly and Inoichi sputtered a bit. This kid killed 5 Nuknin? He really wished that wasn't what he was known for, even if it impressed them. He really didn't like killing people. The redhead had long since proven that even the most savage enemies can become allies. He hoped it could work a second time. I turned 26 about a month ago. Kira was ignored. What's your name, kid? The redhead held back the frustrated sigh. Ibiki was only a year older than him here, and Inoichi wasn't much older, 10 or so years from what Kira could remember. Uzumaki Kiru. He hadn't intended to say his surname, but he couldn't help it. The name held the implications of war, and if it would get them to stop calling him kid, he'd take it. Jiraiya didn't count since the man was his godfather, and called him brat more often than either of his names in either timeline unless the situation was serious. Can you really remove the seal? Ibiki tried not to look desperate, but Kira had seen even the weakest men crack under the hope that something will work after years of suffering. He'd nearly broken under it as well. He met Ibiki's dark eyes head-on, unwavering. I can. And he could. Once he figured it out, it was startlingly easy. Orochimaru wasn't a master of seals like Kiru or Jiraiya, and weeks studying the design while hiding out in one of the Sanin's old bases had provided all the answers. It was a wealth of contradictions, layers that didn't need to exist but served as a means of making its removal more difficult than it needed to be. It wasn't even the kind of seal Danzo used to silence root members where it vanished upon his death. No, instead it served as yet another method of coming back to life. Kiru really hated immortals. Ibiki and Inoichi, though the blonde had yet to actually tell him that, looked at each other before turning back to him, appraising him for a few moments before leaving. He wondered if they were going to bring Anko here or how any of this was supposed to work. The table was silent for a few moments before Kakashi spoke in a light tone. I guess that means you two won't be sparring later then. He sounded way too happy about it. He hadn't even been in Konoha for a day, and his life had already become chaos. What just happened? Jiraiya laughed, but Kira was willing to bet he didn't know either. The beef on the grill was starting to overcook, and Kira was tempted to let it and make the pervy sage deal with it while he turned tail and ran, because physical strength aside, Anko was scary. He flipped the beef anyway. Let it be known that no matter what state she's in, grateful or pissed off, Anko was terrifying. Kira knew this, of course, before he even met the woman for the first time in this timeline. Though, when he was Naruto, he never actually had an exceptionally grateful Anko after him before. She'd been grateful when he saved the village, sure, but it wasn't personal. Removing her curse seal was very personal. No one else had been able to do it before Kira managed it, and in the timeline before it only disappeared after Orochimaru used it to resurrect himself again. Anko had been trying to track him down for almost a week, trying to show her appreciation, and while Kira definitely admired her gratefulness, he didn't want everyone being this grateful for these kinds of things. If someone has the ability, there shouldn't need to be any kind of compensation. Kira knew that not everyone thought that way, but it was one of the only things left of Naruto in him other than his DNA, and even that might be different now. Kira had a feeling that if Anko finally did find him, he'd be experiencing less of her appreciation and more of her frustration, but the redhead was nothing if not determined, and he diligently avoided her. If Kira had his way, she'd only find him if he were either on a mission with her, unlikely but not impossible, or if he was better than, less likely than Konohamaru becoming Hokage at age 8 probably. He vividly remembered the Chunin exams and had no plans to repeat that situation. If he did, it would likely be 1,000 times worse, since he was now a grown man and not a 12-year-old boy, and the container of the Kyuubi, at least to her knowledge. She didn't believe him at first. There weren't many sealing masters left, and even Jiraiya couldn't remove it. The only reason he even knew how to begin with was because they found the sealing formula for it. Technically, he'd lied about why he knew how to remove it, since Orochimaru had, in fact, resurrected himself through Sasuke's seal, but he didn't lie about the time it took to figure out how to remove it before then. By the time they did, they had no use for it. Anko's seal was gone, and so was Sasuke's, and no one else alive that they knew of had one. It was still good to know, just in case, especially after the discussion about time travel began, and finally he was able to actually use that knowledge. When Ibiki and Inoichi finally returned with Anko, she looked distraught. Anger and confusion and hope and fear clouded her face and made it hard for Kira to determine her intentions. She took a deep breath and looked him in the eyes. Brown met deep blue and Kira could practically feel her anxiety. Can you really remove it? He'd already answered the question for Ibiki and Inoichi, but he could understand her need to hear the answer with her own ears. Yes. His voice didn't waver, he didn't look away, he met her head on and simply told her the truth. Kira had been expecting to talk to the Hokage about it, and then set up a proper time and place to do it under what would probably be more supervision than strictly necessary. He should have known better, if he was being honest with himself. Instead, Enko grabbed his thin, pale arm and yanked. The purple-haired woman dragged him out of the booth, out of the restaurant, and directly into the Hokage's office at a speed that would probably make his father jealous. The bijou within him were on edge, but Kirin knew better and allowed the dangle-loving woman to pull him. He was just glad their swift and unexpected arrival didn't give the Sandaime a heart attack. Enko jabbed a finger at him. Claims he can remove my seal. You're gonna watch him do it. Her tone left little room for argument, even for the Hokage. Kiri gave the old man his best apologetic look and pulled a chair for her to sit on. It was useless, both men knew, to argue with her when she was in this kind of mood. Enko was rarely this serious, and no punishment would prevent her from doing what she wanted. This is going to hurt, he turned to the Hokage. It might be better to put some kind of soundproofing up. Tuambu appeared out of seemingly nowhere, and did exactly that. Okay. Do you have anything to bite down on? I know there's soundproofing, but this is more for everyone in the room. Even though he was clearly taking the situation seriously, Kira kept his tone light, and through his calmness, he could see some of Enko's anxiety melt away. The snake user took her coat off and bit the sleeve. You're probably going to be pretty tired after this, so please make sure to get rest. When you recover, you should feel a difference in your chakra. If not, come find me. After all, he never actually removed it before, and he had no idea what kind of consequences could arise from it. The only reason he knew the actual removal would be painful and tiring was because of personal experiences he'd rather forget about. It was, in fact, a painful process, not just for Enko but for both of them, and even though the actual removal only took a little while, it was exhausting. Even with Gyuki's help. The actual removal took less than 15 minutes, and just as he finished, Jiraiya and Kakashi were jumping through the office window and staring. Enko looked like a mess. She was sweating and breathing heavy. It likely wasn't a state most people had seen her in before. Even Kiru only saw her looking similar when they were fighting in the war. The redhead was no better. Kiru's hair was slightly frizzy, and his pale skin glistened with sweat. He hid his own panting breath well, but not enough to fool anyone who wasn't exhausted and only vaguely aware. Despite this, however, every part of him was still alert. He didn't need much sleep anyway, and something like this would only tack on another hour or so, if that. He wasn't worried. He hadn't been expecting a brown, purple, and orange blur charging at him the following day, though. He booked it, of course, and got a lot of odd looks from villagers. Aside from coming out late after yet another near-sleepless night, he didn't leave his new lodgings at Jiraiya's barely used Konoha home much after that, which was unfortunate because it meant that he'd have to confront her at some point. Today was not going to be that day, though. Kira was a stubborn man, had been stubborn since birth, and would probably be stubborn until the day he died. He was also completely aware that regardless of the time he went out, he always had tails most of the time. Early in the morning, Kakashi was one of those tails. He probably wasn't supposed to know that, though. In a brief moment of stupidity he hadn't acted on since he was 16, on the 8th day in the village he stopped paying attention, only for a second, while running away from Enko, and consequently, he nearly plowed Kakashi into the ground. He'd been trying to get groceries, but the younger, gods, she was younger than him now, woman had other plans, and he bolted from the supermarket instead. The silver-haired shinobi reacted accordingly, and promptly slammed him into the wall. He might have made a snarky comment about kinks if he wasn't hyper-aware of the crazy woman closing in on him. Instead he ducked under the man's arm, and called out a quick apology before continuing to run. Uzumaki Kira was weird. Those 4 words had crossed Kakashi's many times over the last 7 days. The man hardly left his apartment, except to abuse the poor training grounds at night. Even if he did restore them before leaving, the damage he was capable of causing was amazing and slightly terrifying. Kakashi also wondered if he was still holding back. When the redhead did go out, he seemed even more aware than before, and if he didn't know Enko or hadn't seen the pursuit with his own eye, he might not have believed it. It was odd because someone with as much power as Kira should be able to defend easily. Enko wasn't even close to being the strongest in the village. She was certainly a formidable opponent, especially when she was angry, but even then there were still stronger ones. She wasn't even angry at him, though his avoidance was bound to change that, Kakashi couldn't find it in him to pity Kira for that. The Sharingan user had no idea why the man was so opposed to her gratitude. Kakashi knew why he would be opposed to it, but there was no way she'd do that to someone that could still be an enemy, right? He was so open about his past at times, all while still being infuriatingly vague, and so completely closed off other times. He was a living paradox. His best friend made attempts on his life and he'd still genuinely cared for him, didn't even hold a grudge. He was a survivor of war and, like any other surviving Uzumaki clan members, completely vanished. He took down 5 new Knin, but he was so far from a cold-blooded killer/assassin for hire. Kakashi actually saw him bringing food to the stray cats near Red Light District, even if he denied it. His smiles were real, at least most of the time, yet his eyes were practically brimming with agony. He had lost a good handful of people in his life, only truly loving a few. No idea how the redhead did it. How Kira smiled, really smiled, every day, even though he seemed to be reminded of his loss everywhere. Yes, Uzumaki Kira was very weird. They hadn't had many opportunities to actually talk after Anko kidnapped him. He was either holed up in his room, he wasn't going to invade his only